Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little ripe. You ever wonder what it would really be like to walk the cobbled streets of medieval Europe? I mean, not in some romanticised knights and fair maidens way, but the raw, unfiltered reality of living in a world where your bathwater might be 3 months old and brushing your teeth was considered optional at best. Welcome to the dirty truth of medieval hygiene, where soap is scarce, people think cold water can kill you, and the stench of daily life is just part of the neighbourhood charm. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I know the vibe isn't always sweet dreams and fairy tales, but I promise it's always memorable. Also, drop your city and local time in the comments. Let's see who's listening from the most medieval sounding place tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a narrow alley. It's early morning, but there's no fresh smell in the air, just a mix of manure, mildew, yesterday's kitchen scraps, and something definitely dead nearby. Chickens peck at the ground around your boots, and a stray dog noses a slop bucket. A window creaks open above you, and without warning, a woman dumps the contents of her chamber pot straight down. You jump out of the way. Almost. It splashes next to you, warm and pungent. Welcome to daily hygiene in the Middle Ages. And that smell? That's your new reality. Personal hygiene in this time isn't exactly personal or hygienic. Most people don't bathe regularly, and it's not because they're lazy. It's because they genuinely believe bathing might kill them. The logic goes like this: water opens the pores, pores let in sickness, therefore getting wet is basically inviting death into your bloodstream. Makes sense, if you ignore all science. Ironically, this fear of water developed centuries after one of the cleanest civilizations in history, ancient Rome, built aqueducts, public baths and private plumbing. But after Rome fell, the infrastructure decayed, and with it, the concept of clean and healthy just vanished. Bathhouses were abandoned, aqueducts turned to rubble, and indoor plumbing, you can forget it. The Middle Ages didn't just stop the bathing, they forgot how to. In some villages, people do still bathe, kind of. Maybe once a year, usually in May or June when the weather warms up. The whole family shares the same tub, starting with the father, followed by the mother, then the kids in descending age. By the time the baby goes in, it's less of a bath and more of a soup, a very human-flavoured one. This is actually where the phrase "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater" comes from. The water was so dirty by the end that yes, you could literally lose a baby in it. And even if you wanted to stay clean, good luck finding resources. Soap is rare, expensive, and often made from harsh ingredients like lye or animal fat. Some of it smells worse than what it's trying to clean. If you're rich, you might afford olive oil soap from Spain. If not, you're scrubbing with ash and sand and hoping the dirt gives up before your skin does. Now, here's a quirky little gem for you. Some nobles and monks actually kept small animals like ferrets in their clothing. Not as pets, but to eat lice. Yep, little live flea eaters crawling around your underlayers, munching away at the parasites you didn't have time or tools to remove. Is it weird? Yes. Is it kind of genius? Also yes. Medieval problems call for medieval solutions. But here's the real kicker. People knew they stank. The idea that medieval folks just didn't notice the smell is a myth. They noticed. They just didn't have the tools, resources, or frankly, the cultural mindset to do much about it. Scented herbs were stuffed into pockets, pinned to collars, or even braided into hair to mask odours. Lavender, rosemary and mint were the medieval equivalent of deodorant, just more visible and leafy. There's actually a pretty big scholarly debate about how widespread hygiene rituals really were. Some researchers argue that the idea of everyone being perpetually filthy is exaggerated, pointing to medieval texts that mention washing hands before meals or cleaning feet before bed. Others say these were idealised habits, aspirational, not actual daily practice. And when you look at the general state of plumbing, waste disposal, and how many diseases were floating around at the time, it's hard to believe those hand-washing rules made it into every hut and hovel. You walk a little farther down the muddy road, ducking past carts and stray geese. Outside a tavern, a man is dumping something into the gutter. It runs slowly towards the nearest drain, or what counts as a drain here. You don't want to look too closely. The whole town smells like damp wool, stale ale, and human waste. It's a flavour that clings to everything, including your clothes and hair, and there's no escape from it, not really. You sleep in it, you eat in it, you wake up with it crusted under your fingernails, and yet life goes on. People get married, kids play in the street, there are festivals, music, markets. You might be filthy, but so is everyone else. It's a kind of great equaliser. You don't have to worry about being judged for smelling bad unless you're really pushing the limits. It's just part of life. Smell isn't shameful, it's inevitable, but deep down, there's always that fear, especially during times of plague or sickness, that being too clean or too exposed could make things worse, that maybe keeping the dirt on acts like a barrier, like armour. It's not logical, but when science isn't a thing yet, fear tends to win. And as the day fades and the torches are lit, the scent of the medieval world only deepens. It's not just dirty, it's layered, complex, oddly human. And this is only the beginning. You walk past the crumbling stone arch of what used to be a Roman bathhouse, now choked with weeds and broken columns. It's barely recognisable. A few wild goats graze near the edge, totally unaware that this used to be one of the cleanest places in Europe. You step through the moss-covered threshold and into a ghost of cleanliness. Once, this place would have been full of steam, laughter, conversation, hot water running freely through a marvel of engineering. Now it's just a ruin, silent except for the drip of water from a cracked fountain that hasn't been touched in generations. See, before the Middle Ages fully descended into their long, pungent slump, people actually knew how to stay pretty clean, and no one did it better than the Romans. Public bathhouses, thermae, were a cornerstone of Roman life. You'd go not just to bathe, but to socialise, exercise, eat, even conduct business. And yes, men and women had separate times or sections depending on the city and the era. There were heated floors, copper piping, cold plunges, warm pools, saunas, you name it. For ancient Rome, bathing wasn't just practical, it was civilised. It was Roman. Then came the fall. As the Roman Empire crumbled in the 5th century, so did its infrastructure. Without the vast engineering machine to maintain them, the aqueducts fell into disrepair. Pipes burst, public buildings decayed. Suddenly, the cleanest cities in the ancient world became ghost towns, and worse, over time people began to fear the very things the Romans had perfected. Water, nakedness, public bathing. What once was a cultural high point turned into something suspicious, even sinful. You glance around the bathhouse ruins, half expecting echoes of sandals slapping wet marble, maybe a splash from some ghostly bathgoer diving into the frigidarium. But there's only wind now, stirring the grass through the broken floor tiles. The grandeur is gone. Fast forward a few centuries and the medieval worldview has fully shifted. Cleanliness is no longer tied to civility. Instead, it's tangled in theology. The Church's growing influence begins reshaping ideas about the body, modesty, and moral purity. Washing yourself becomes less about physical health and more about spiritual meaning, or sometimes a spiritual threat. Bathing naked? That invites lust. Frequent bathing? That's vanity, and vanity, as we know, is a sin. Now, to be fair, because early medieval monasteries often preserved Roman traditions better than the outside world. Some monastic rules included regular washing of hands and feet, especially before prayer. Certain abbeys even had rudimentary plumbing systems and scheduled bathing days. But as time marched on and disease swept across the continent, fear, not logic, began to dominate hygiene practices, which brings us to an absolutely weird twist in history. In some places, being dirty was considered holy. Saints' lives were filled with tales of people who refused to bathe as a sign of spiritual devotion. Take St. Godric, who wore a hair shirt and lived in filth as an act of humility, or St. Thomas Becket, who reportedly wore the same clothes so long they had to be cut off. Dirt became a badge of holiness, a rejection of the physical in favour of the spiritual, and if you smelled, all the better. That was the scent of devotion. But not everyone was on board. Some noble courts, especially in southern Europe, closer to Roman ruins and remnants, tried to hold on to cleanliness. In Muslim Spain and Byzantine Constantinople, bathing traditions held strong for centuries. Lavish bathhouses thrived in Cordoba and Baghdad, influenced by both Greco-Roman and Islamic hygienic values. In these regions, cleanliness was seen not as vanity, but virtue. It was tied to ritual, purity, and health. So while northern Europe wallowed in the mud, southern cities still shimmered, at least relatively speaking. Still, the northern attitude dominated. especially as Latin Christianity spread. And so did the architectural decay. Pipes rusted, drainage systems collapsed. Even the idea of hot water became foreign. By the time you reach the height of the medieval period, bathing is practically taboo. Most people rely on dry washing, rubbing themselves with cloths or using oil to pull dirt from the skin. Think of it as medieval dry shampoo, just without the pleasant coconut scent. You run your hand along the edge of an old Roman tub, stone smooth and cracked with age, and you realise it's not just the technology they lost. It was the belief that humans deserved to be clean, that washing your body was an act of respect, not indulgence. A whole civilization that once prized hygiene as part of daily life had given way to generations who feared it might damn their souls, or at least give them pneumonia. There's a scholarly tug of war over how intentional this decline really was. Some argue that the Middle Ages weren't nearly as dirty as popular history suggests, that the myth of filthy medievals is a 19th century exaggeration. They point to records of washing rituals, references to perfumes, and the survival of certain grooming habits in noble courts. Others say those examples are exceptions, not the rule, and that the average peasant was bathing so infrequently that even writing about it felt notable. The truth, as always, probably sits somewhere in between. Cleanliness was valued, but hard to achieve and often deprioritized in the face of survival, war, famine, and deeply entrenched beliefs. You step back out of the ruin and into the noise of the town. A procession of muddy carts clatters down the street. Children chase each other past open sewage drains. A man hawks roasted chestnuts next to a pig chewing on something that used to be part of a boot. There are no baths here, no aqueducts, just buckets, barrels, and a very creative relationship with the concept of clean. And as you walk on, you realise something sobering. The Roman world is gone, and with it a legacy of hygiene that wouldn't fully return to Europe for nearly 1,000 years. Until then, the continent would stumble through darkness, scratching, sweating, and smelling its way forward. You wake up the next morning on a straw-stuffed mattress that smells like damp wool and questionable choices. Your blanket is a scratchy, flea-infested excuse for comfort, and your tunic, stiff with sweat and who knows what from yesterday, is the only one you own. There's no running water, no soap on the nightstand, no toothbrush. If you're lucky, you might have a chipped ceramic basin with some rainwater from last week. But even that comes with a mental calculation. Do I want to risk using it? Welcome to the Middle Ages, where water is not your friend, it's a gamble. People didn't avoid bathing just because they didn't feel like it. They avoided it because they thought it could actually kill them. This wasn't superstition for the sake of drama. This was the genuinely held belief that water, especially warm water, opened up the skin and left you vulnerable to disease. You weren't just washing off dirt, you were supposedly washing away your body's natural protection. And if that protection went down, the plague could get in, or the sweating sickness, or one of the 1,000 other illnesses floating around in the muck of medieval life. You fill a small pitcher from the barrel outside. The water is murky, tinged green, and smells faintly of pond. Still, it's the best you've got. You splash some onto your face and immediately regret it. It's ice cold despite the sunny morning and leaves behind a gritty residue. There's a film to it like someone else has used it already, which honestly, they probably have. People in this era didn't trust standing water for a reason. Rivers were cleaner, but only upstream. Downstream was where waste was dumped, human, animal, industrial, all of it. Wells were better, but they were still vulnerable to contamination. If someone died of disease nearby, that well was basically a death lottery. Rainwater collection was ideal but not reliable, and boiled water, a luxury. Firewood wasn't cheap and boiling took time. It just wasn't practical for the average person to treat every drop of water that came near them. You'd think, with all this anxiety about sickness, that the solution would be more cleaning. But the logic ran the other way. The more you stayed dry, the more you stayed safe, or so they thought. And when water was involved, it was usually in the smallest, most symbolic doses. Maybe a bit for your hands before a meal, maybe a trickle to rinse your feet if they were absolutely unbearable. Full body baths? That was risky business. That brings us to a weird side note. Some medieval doctors did advocate for bathing. They claimed that it helped balance the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Yes, those lovely fluids were the cornerstones of medieval medicine. Too much black bile, maybe a warm sylvan soak will help. Feeling melancholic? Steam might realign your inner juices, but, and here's the catch, only if your body was strong enough to handle it. If you were already sick or frail, bathing was thought to make things worse. And don't get excited. Bathing, in this context, didn't always mean a full soak. Sometimes it meant rubbing your body with a dry cloth or maybe applying vinegar to your armpits, like a salad dressing for your sweat glands. Some wealthier folks used rose water or herbal infusions to cleanse themselves aromatically, not functionally. It wasn't about removing filth, it was about shifting the scent profile. So let's say you're the kind of person who wants to keep clean anyway. You're stubborn, maybe a little delusional. You're going to draw a bath. That means hauling buckets, lots of them, from the nearest water source. Heating it over a fire for hours, pouring it into a wooden tub that leaks if you don't sit just right. Then what? Do you have soap? Maybe, but it's probably homemade, stinky and borderline corrosive. A mix of animal fat, ash and herbs if you're lucky. If you're not, it'll strip your skin and leave you redder than when you started. Now here's your quirky fact for the day. Some people believed that too much bathing could actually make you smell worse. The idea was that it disrupted your natural balance, making your sweat more pungent and your body more open to rot. Think of it like the medieval version of, if you wash your hair too much it gets greasy faster, except with way higher stakes and a lot more plague. Speaking of plague, this was the age when people were starting to draw connections, flawed but earnest, between water, cleanliness and disease. Unfortunately, they got the cause-effect relationship completely backward. Bathing was blamed for making the body susceptible. Clean people still died. Dirty people sometimes survived. That was all the proof they needed. It didn't help that public bathhouses, which we'll get into later, became associated with sex, sin and contagion. So even the few places where you could take a bath came with a side of moral panic. There's a fascinating scholarly debate here about whether medieval people truly feared water itself, or whether it was just the logistics, the scarcity, the danger of communal spaces. Some historians argue that the fear of bathing has been overstated, exaggerated by later centuries trying to make the past look grosser than it really was. Others insist that the fear was very real, very prevalent, and reinforced by generations of religious teaching and pseudoscience. Either way, the cultural vibe was clear, water was not to be trusted. So how did people stay sort of clean? They didn't. Okay, fine, they tried. They brushed off dirt, they used linen undershirts to absorb sweat and change them occasionally. They washed their hands and faces when absolutely necessary. Some even cleaned their feet before bed, especially in noble households. But full hygiene? That was not the standard, that was the exception, and if you smelled weird, so did everyone else. As you head out into the street, you notice a baker tossing the remains of yesterday's dough into the gutter. A group of kids splash through it, barefoot. A woman rinses a cloth in a barrel of greyish water, wrings it out and goes back to wiping down her stool. Nobody thinks twice about it. This is just the daily choreography of a world where cleanliness is relative. Survival is the goal and the risk of water is part of the cost of staying alive. And you, freshly splashed and no cleaner than when you started, are finally beginning to understand why in this world, the smell of another person isn't just tolerated, it's practically invisible. It's the background noise of an era that's decided it has bigger things to worry about than soap and suds. You duck into a low-ceilinged building with a slanted timber roof, the door creaking on its hinge as a wave of warm, sour-smelling steam greets you like a damp slap to the face. You've made it into one of the rare public bathhouses that still operates in this corner of medieval Europe. Inside, the air is thick, moist, cloudy and slightly floral, like someone spilled a bottle of cheap rose oil in a barn. There's laughter echoing off the walls, muffled splashes from behind a curtain, and somewhere nearby someone singing very off-key, and yes, everyone's mostly naked. Welcome to medieval spa day. Now before you start thinking this is some relaxing escape from the grime, let's adjust expectations. This bathhouse is not the elegant marble oasis you might imagine from Roman times. It's more like a wooden shack with hot tubs made from giant barrels or carved stone basins. There's soot on the ceiling, mud on the floors, and the water, let's just say it's seen better days. It's heated by a furnace in the back that doubles as a fire hazard and a tetanus risk, but for now, it's as close as you're going to get to clean. Public bathhouses were surprisingly common in the earlier part of the Middle Ages, especially during the 12th and 13th centuries. Some towns had several, usually clustered near rivers or natural hot springs. The setup was simple. You'd pay a small fee, or barter with something mildly useful like eggs or goat cheese, strip down and join the communal bath. There were hot rooms, cold plunges, steam rooms, and sometimes even massage services. It wasn't luxurious, but it was functional and social, very social. You're probably noticing something here. Communal bathing in a society that's supposedly terrified of water? Yeah, it's complicated. While many people avoided private bathing, public bathhouses survived as a kind of loophole. The water was heated, the ritual was controlled, and more importantly, it became a space for more than just hygiene. It was a hub of social life. People came here to relax, gossip, flirt, negotiate, and sometimes engage in less wholesome activities behind the steam curtain. And that's where things get messy, literally and morally. You settle into a basin, careful not to think too hard about how many people have been in here before you. The water is warm, murky, and carries the faint scent of rosemary. Someone probably threw in a handful of herbs to suggest cleanliness. Across the room, two merchants argue about grain prices, while an older woman dips a comb into the bathwater and starts grooming her granddaughter's hair. A friar sneaks a peek at a laundress adjusting her towel. It's a weird mix of sacred, profane, and soap-adjacent. Bathhouses like this weren't just tolerated, they were part of daily life in many cities. In Paris, London, and German towns like Nuremberg or Cologne, bathhouses were thriving businesses, sometimes attached to inns or taverns. Couples could rent private tubs for the evening, which, predictably, gave bathhouses a reputation for being not-so-secret brothels. The church frowned on this, of course, issuing the occasional stern warning about nudity and temptation. But the bathhouses kept going for a while. Here's a fun fringe fact. Bath attendants in medieval times were often skilled in other things, like minor surgery or dentistry. So while you soaked, someone might offer to lance a boil or yank a tooth. Nothing says relaxation like having a molar extracted next to a naked stranger in a warm tub. And if you were feeling truly fancy, some bathhouses offered food and drink during your visit. Ale, meat pies and wine, all while you marinated in communal sweat. This was fine dining, medieval edition. But as the 14th century rolled in, things started to change. Plagues began to sweep across Europe, not just the big one in 1347, but earlier outbreaks too, and people grew increasingly suspicious of public spaces, especially warm, wet ones filled with half-dressed strangers. The same communal water that brought people together now became a breeding ground for fear. Bathhouses, once social centres, started to close or get repurposed. Some burned down and were never rebuilt. Others were shut by civic leaders or condemned by the church. That leads to an ongoing scholarly debate. Were bathhouses really the hotbeds of disease people feared, or was that just a case of bad timing and scapegoating? Some historians argue that poor water sanitation and reused bathwater made them genuinely risky during pandemics. Others believe the closure of bathhouses was more about controlling morality and behaviour than preventing illness. After all, when half the town's scandals are happening behind the steam curtain, someone's going to want to shut that down. Back in your wooden tub, the water is cooling. A few people have already dried off and wandered back into the street, leaving puddles as footprints behind. You notice someone quietly scratching their arm, again and again, until the skin reddens. Bathing didn't kill the lice, it just made them wet. That's the thing most people forget. Even when they bathed, medieval folks weren't sterile. There was no disinfectant, no antibacterial soap. You got the dirt off maybe, but the parasites stuck around, and you were probably just putting dirty clothes right back on after anyway. Still, for a few hours there's a psychological lift to being here. Your skin feels slightly less crusted in yesterday's sweat. You're surrounded by humans being vaguely human, sharing stories, food, and bacteria. It's uncomfortable, a little weird, and oddly intimate. This isn't the sanitized solitude of a modern shower, it's bathing as community theatre, complete with a full cast, background vocals, and unexpected plot twists. As you wrap a linen cloth around your still damp body and prepare to leave, you wonder if maybe this moment, warmth, water, conversation, is the closest thing medieval life has to therapy. No one's pretending they're spotless, but for a little while they can pretend they're clean enough. You step back into the street, steam trailing from your hair, already mixing with the dust, ash, and stench of the world outside. And just like that, you're dirty again. You haven't even been outside for 5 minutes before your scalp starts itching. At first you ignore it, probably just the wind drying your still damp hair. Then it gets worse, that deep creeping kind of itch that makes you want to claw your skin off. You reach up and feel something move. No, but yes, congratulations. You now have a lice problem, like practically everyone else in the Middle Ages. Forget bathwater, because when it comes to medieval hygiene, hair is where the real chaos lives. Across the muddy road, a woman is sitting on a stool with her daughter in her lap, picking through her hair with 2 sticks and a furrowed brow. She's doing what everyone did back then, de-lousing 1 knit at a time. No special shampoo, no sprays, just patience, fingernails, and occasionally fire. Some folks took the scorched earth approach, literally holding a candle under hair to roast lice out. Bold, right? Until your bangs catch fire. Now you're probably wondering, why didn't they just shave it all off? Oh, but they did. Shaving was actually a go-to solution for lice and fleas, especially for monks, nuns and soldiers. Tonsures, the shaved crowns of monks' heads, weren't just about religious symbolism. They also helped with pest control. Less hair, fewer hiding places, at least in theory. But full shaving? That came with its own set of problems. First off, razors weren't exactly ergonomic. Or sharp or safe. One slip and you're dealing with infection in a world that doesn't know what a germ is. Also, hair served practical purposes. Warmth in the cold months, protection from the sun, and of course vanity. Even in a lice-ridden world, style mattered. Which brings us to beards, glorious medieval beards. For men, beards were more than facial hair. They were identity, status symbols, and sometimes accidental wildlife sanctuaries. Beards were often long, unkempt, and treated like extensions of the personality. Knights and nobles might oil them, braid them, or even dust them with powder to appear fancier. But underneath all that pomp, you guessed it, lice, and worse. You walk past a tavern where a bearded blacksmith is casually scratching his chin with a pair of iron tongs. Across the way, a friar with a patchy beard is rubbing rosemary into his cheeks, muttering something that might be a prayer or a curse. Everyone's itching, scratching, twitching. It's a symphony of mild suffering. There were attempts at grooming, of course. Combs were everywhere, usually carved from bone or wood, small enough to carry and often used in a daily, or weekly, let's be honest, war against bugs. You could sit by the fire with a friend or family member and take turns combing each other's hair, cracking lice between your fingernails with satisfying little pops. Cozy, right? It's like a Netflix night, but instead of popcorn, it's blood-sucking parasites. Want a quirky twist? Some people actually collected their lice, for fun or for religious reasons. There are records of saints proudly describing their lice as pearls of God, or companions in suffering. It wasn't just tolerated, it was sometimes revered, a kind of martyrdom through itching. One medieval mystic even let the lice feed on her as a sign of holy patience. You, meanwhile, are starting to rethink your life choices just for stepping into this world. And it wasn't just lice. Fleas were everywhere, and they weren't picky. Beds, clothes, pets, floors, your favourite hat. Anywhere warm and dark was fair game. You'd wake up with red welts, spend the day scratching, and then do it all again. People tried everything to stop them. Herbs, oils, smoke, even rot's onions hung around the neck. Spoiler, it didn't work. At best, you just smelled worse than the fleas. So how did society deal with the universal bug problem? Mostly by pretending it was normal, which, in fairness, it was. No one had the luxury of being bug-free, so it stopped being a source of shame and became just another part of daily life. People talked about their lice, joked about their fleas, they accepted it like we accept traffic or cold coffee. Annoying, yes. Avoidable? Not really. There's a scholarly debate over how seriously medieval people took grooming. Some argue that grooming tools like combs, tweezers and mirrors were more common than we give them credit for. Archaeological digs have uncovered a surprising number of these items, even among poorer households. This suggests that people did try to look after themselves, at least on the surface. But then there's the counter-argument. What good is a bone comb when your bedding is full of rodents and your clothes are basically mobile bug farms? And speaking of clothes, lice didn't stop at your hair. They lived in your seams, your underlayers, especially in the folds of linen shirts and woolen hose. Washing clothes helped, sort of, but it wasn't easy. Laundry required a river, ash, lye, and several hours of hard labour. Most people just wore the same clothes for days or weeks on end. Maybe they'd change an undershirt now and then, but full outfit swaps? Rare. Which means lice weren't just freeloading on your scalp, they had beachfront property across your entire wardrobe. You reach under your collar and pull out a squirming little hitchhiker. Flick it away. It lands in the dust with a tiny, satisfied bounce. Somewhere in the distance, a dog scratches so hard it falls over. And yet somehow, life goes on. People get married, go to festivals, sing songs and flirt in taverns, all while itching, all while hosting tiny colonies on their bodies. It sounds gross because it is, but it's also a weirdly bonding experience. No one escapes it. Nobles, peasants, monks, maidens, everyone is in this together. There's no medieval shampoo, no exterminators, no relief, just fingernails, boiling water, and the occasional ferret in your sleeve. Yeah, that's a real thing. In some noble households, people kept small animals, like ferrets or weasels, to control vermin. The logic? These little guys would crawl around in your clothes and eat whatever bugs they found. Was it effective? Debatable that it was horrifying to imagine? Absolutely, but desperate times call for creative and slightly terrifying solutions. You scratch your scalp one last time and sigh. It's going to be a long day, but hey, at least now you blend in, because in the Middle Ages, a few lice weren't a crisis, they were just part of the crowd. You take refuge under the crumbling arch of a stone chapel, hoping for shade, and maybe a break from the cloud of invisible bugs that's apparently made your body its forever home. Inside, the smell is cooler, less sour, more earthy. The faint scent of incense still clings to the air like a ghost. Rows of wooden pews creak under the weight of no one, and a tapestry flutters in a breeze from an unseen window. You sit, trying not to think about the lice you've just relocated from your neck to your collarbone. And here, in the semi-sacred quiet, you start to understand how the church became the beating heart of both cleanliness and filth in the Middle Ages. If there's one group that tried, however awkwardly, to keep some kind of hygiene culture alive during this time, it was the monks and nuns. But don't get your hopes up. This isn't a story about God-loving germaphobes in spotless robes. It's about how being spiritually clean often meant being physically, let's say, crusty. See, cleanliness wasn't always viewed as a virtue in the literal sense. In fact, among the deeply religious, avoiding bathing was a sign of holy discipline. Denying the body meant elevating the soul. You weren't supposed to enjoy earthly things, warm water, scented oils, the feeling of not being covered in your own dried sweat. Those pleasures were dangerous. They hinted at vanity, luxury, temptation. And the body, it was basically a sack of sin waiting to drag your soul down. Better to ignore it. You shift on the pew, suddenly very aware of how itchy your shirt is. Probably wool, probably not washed this decade. It's exactly the kind of garment a self-denying monk would wear, especially if it was a hair shirt, one of those delightful medieval torture snuggies made from coarse animal hair, designed specifically to itch, chafe, and remind you that comfort is for the damned. The irony here is almost theatrical. Monasteries were often the cleanest places around. They had better access to water, more structured routines, and the manpower to boil laundry, clean bedding, and scrub floors. Some had actual plumbing systems, granted primitive ones, and scheduled bath days. A few even had separate latrines with drainage systems, rare gems in a world full of poop chutes and chamber pots. The rule of St. Benedict, written in the 6th century, explicitly encouraged washing hands and feet before meals, and even permitted bathing, with moderation of course. But all of this came with strings. You could bathe, but not too often. You could be clean, but not vain. You could enjoy a warm soak, but only if it was for health or obedience, not God forbid because it felt nice. It was like spiritual calorie counting. Indulging in comfort had to be balanced by a heaping side of guilt. And then there were the saints. You can't talk about medieval hygiene without acknowledging these holy overachievers who went all in on the clean soul, dirty body philosophy. St. Francis of Assisi, famous for embracing poverty, wearing rags, and avoiding bathing, like it was the devil himself. St. Margaret of Cortona slept in doorways and wore clothes that hadn't been washed in years. One saint, who shall remain nameless for your sanity, refused to wash so long that insects nested in her skin, and she considered it part of her spiritual suffering. Now, this wasn't the norm for every nun and monk. Plenty lived moderately, scrubbed their faces, and brushed their teeth with chewed herbs or little cloths. But the legends and stories that got passed down were usually the extremes, because those made for better sermons. You didn't get sainthood by being the guy who washed twice a week and flossed. You got it by suffering. And if that suffering involved smelling like a dead goat in July, even better. Meanwhile, the average medieval layperson often looked to monks and nuns as examples of purity, not just moral, but physical. If a saint avoided bathing and still made it to heaven, maybe that meant dirt wasn't such a bad thing after all. Cleanliness might even be suspicious, dangerous, something that put you at risk of vanity, pride, or worse, lust. So yes, in a strange twist of logic, staying dirty became holy. And because the church was the moral compass of the age, this belief trickled down into everyday life. Parents didn't encourage their kids to bathe. Husbands didn't expect their wives to smell like lavender. Women especially were told to keep their bodies modest, hidden, and uncorrupted by adornments like perfumes or excessive grooming. Haircuts, bathing, or even wearing clean clothes could be seen as signs of vanity, or, for women, seduction. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how seriously these views were followed. Some historians argue that the whole dirt equals holiness thing was more symbolic than literal, that most people, even monks, probably bathed when they could. Others insist that the Church's emphasis on spiritual purity directly discouraged physical hygiene in much of Europe for centuries. The truth, as usual, is probably a mix. The rules existed, but people bent them when they needed to, especially if they started smelling themselves. You walk deeper into the chapel, passing an old font filled with stagnant holy water. A spider has built a web across it. The marble is chipped, the floor uneven, and somewhere overhead a pigeon coos in the rafters. It's beautiful in a melancholic, crumbling kind of way, and it's very much a metaphor for how medieval people saw their bodies. Flawed, decaying, full of inconvenient fluids, but still worth sanctifying through discomfort and self-denial. You reach the front, where a faded statue of the Virgin Mary stands in dusty silence. Her eyes, once bright with paint, are now just grey smudges, but even in stone there's a sense of serenity. The medieval mind believed that true purity didn't come from scrubbing your skin pore raw. It came from rejecting the desire to be clean in the first place. That's what separated the saints from the sinners. Dirt wasn't just tolerated, it was proof of discipline. Still, you can't help but think, what did it smell like in here during a packed Sunday Mass in July? Hundreds of unwashed bodies, stuffed shoulder to shoulder, singing hymns and sweating through wool tunics. The incense had to work overtime, and the priests, likely no cleaner than the crowd. Holiness, after all, didn't come as in a bar of soap. You step back out into the sunlight, blinking at the sudden brightness. The town is alive with sound, vendors shouting, chickens squawking, bells ringing from the tower. And somewhere underneath it all, that unmistakable, sour, sweet smell of humanity clings to the air like fog. You're starting to get used to it. You're walking along a riverbank now, the water moving sluggishly, brownish-green, and dotted with leaves and things you'd rather not identify. A few women stand knee-deep near the edge, beating bundles of cloth against smooth stones with a rhythm that sounds almost musical, until you realise it's the sound of pure frustration. Welcome to Laundry Day medieval style. It's less a domestic chore and more an Olympic event involving brute strength, questionable water sources, and a whole lot of sweat. You get closer, and it hits you, the smell. Not just the river, which smells like damp moss and dead fish, but the clothes themselves. You can smell what's being washed, sweat, wood smoke, mildew, and something with a hint of barnyard funk. One woman lifts a steaming tunic from a bubbling cauldron set over an open fire. It drips thick, grey water as she hoists it into a second tub. She's got soot on her face, her sleeves rolled up, and an expression that says she's been at this since sunrise. She probably has. Washing clothes in the Middle Ages was no light matter. For most people, it was a communal, labour-intensive affair that could take an entire day, or longer. Forget the idea of tossing a load in the machine and hitting delicate. First, you had to haul the water. That could mean multiple trips to a well, stream, or public fountains with heavy wooden buckets. Then you'd heat it over a fire, which required chopping wood, building a hearth, and keeping it going for hours. Next came the actual cleaning process, which was less about gentle cycles and more about aggressive scrubbing. Clothes were boiled, beaten with wooden paddles, scrubbed with sand or soaked in lye, a mixture of ashes and water strong enough to strip the hair off a goat. It worked, sure, but it also shredded fabrics and burned hands. Gloves weren't a thing, neither was skincare. And if you're wondering where people got their soap, well, sometimes they didn't. Soap, when available, was handmade from animal fat, ash and herbs. It was usually saved for body washing, and even then only for the wealthy. For laundry, most people relied on soapwort, a frothy, plant-based cleanser, lye, or even stale urine. Yep, that wasn't a typo. Urine. A common stain remover and bleaching agent. People would collect it in pots and jugs, let it ferment, and then add it to their wash water like some horrifying medieval OxyClean. The ammonia helped break down dirt and oils, though it also made everything smell like a public latrine for a week. You stand awkwardly on the bank, watching as one girl, probably no older than 12, hauls a pile of linens onto a flat stone. She pours a bucket over them, gives a weary sigh, and starts stomping on them with her bare feet. It's not a game, it's just the fastest way to agitate the cloth without tearing it to shreds. Someone nearby is singing softly, a folk song about lost love, or maybe just laundry-induced rage. Here's your fringe fact of the day. Some people believe that washing clothes too often would actually damage your soul, especially if you were a woman. The idea was that physical cleanliness could breed vanity, and vanity led to temptation. So certain devout folks would only wash their clothing when absolutely necessary, which, let's be honest, wasn't never. But it was close. On the flip side, noble households sometimes had professional laundresses whose entire job was to clean garments and linens. These women worked in teams, rotating wash days to prevent water shortages or avoid unclean days on the religious calendar. They had access to better tools, wooden washboards, larger copper cauldrons, and slightly less terrifying soap. But the work was still brutal. Your fancy velvet gown. That didn't go into water at all. It got beaten, brushed, maybe sprinkled with perfume or powdered chalk. Dry cleaning, medieval edition. And it wasn't just about dirt. Washing clothes was one of the few semi-acceptable reasons for women to gather in public spaces. It was social, noisy, and occasionally subversive. Gossip flourished at the river. Secrets passed from one wet shirt to the next. Politic, marriages, pregnancies, local scandals, all churned with the rinse water. If you wanted to know who was feuding, who was cheating, or who had a suspicious rash on their thighs, you came to the riverbank and kept your ears open. Scholars still debate how often people actually washed their clothes. Some argue that even peasants changed and cleaned their undergarments with regularity, especially linens worn close to the body. Others believe that laundry was a special occasion chore, save for holidays, holy days, or lice infestations. Again, the answer's probably somewhere in the middle. Wealth, time, and proximity to clean water all played a role, and sometimes people just didn't bother. You're starting to see a theme, aren't you? It wasn't that medieval people liked being filthy, they just had other priorities: staying alive, staying warm, feeding their kids, avoiding disease, not dying from childbirth, not getting excommunicated, not getting trampled by a cartload of pigs. Clean clothes were great, but not at the cost of half a day's labour and a second-degree burn from a cauldron of boiling lye. You sit on a stone far enough away from the wash-splash zone and watch a woman wring out a tunic until her arms tremble. The veins on her hands are like ropes. Her apron is soaked. Her forehead glistens, but she keeps going. Because once everything's been scrubbed, it still has to be rinsed, dried, beaten again to soften the fabric, and maybe ironed, if they have one of those medieval irons that's just a hot chunk of metal you drag across cloth while praying it doesn't scorch. Later, she'll gather the stiff, sun-dried shirts and wrap them in bundles of wool or linen, hoping they'll stay clean long enough to matter. But tomorrow her husband will shovel manure, her son will fall in the river, and her toddler will throw porridge on everything, and it will start all over again. Laundry, it turns out, was less about feeling clean and more about resetting the baseline of filth. You rise, brush dust from your knees, and nod in silent respect toward the women who are still scrubbing away with stubborn determination. They're fighting a losing battle, but they fight it anyway. One tunic at a time, you're sitting on a crooked bench in the shadow of a tanner's workshop, trying not to breathe through your nose. The air is thick with the unmistakable stench of rotting hides, animal fat, and whatever mystery meat was scraped off a cow's backside before being turned into leather. But you're not here for the leather. You're here because a man just bit into an onion, smiled with yellow jagged teeth, and started telling a story up close. And when he did, it hit you. Medieval breath could be classified as a form of chemical warfare. Welcome to the often overlooked horror of medieval dental hygiene. We've talked about body odour, lice, and laundry water that doubles as a biohazard. But this is personal. This is mouth-to-mouth combat in a world without toothpaste, to dentists, or even the general consensus that brushing your teeth is a good idea. Most people's breath was a cocktail of pickled fish, sour ale, and slowly decaying molars, shaken, not stirred. To be fair, people did notice when teeth went bad. Pain was pain, after all, and they did have rudimentary tools to deal with it. Problem is, those tools were often a pair of pliers and a strong drink. Toothaches were treated by extraction, not repair. Got a rotten tooth? Out it goes. No anaesthetic, no numbing, no gentle hands. Just a guy called a tooth drawer, probably also your local blacksmith, who would yank that sucker right out of your skull in the middle of a market square while 3 kids and a goat watched. You're not making this up. Public tooth pulling was a form of entertainment in some towns. A travelling dentist would set up shop with a little stool and a collection of terrifying metal instruments. People gathered to watch as patients, screamed their way to relief. Sometimes the tooth puller would hold up the bloody tooth like a trophy, waving it around like a prized turnip. Applause all around. But let's rewind a bit. What about preventative care? Did people do anything to maintain their teeth before it came to that? Actually, yes. Sort of. Many medieval people used toothpicks, little slivers of wood or bone, to dislodge food from between their teeth. They were surprisingly common and could even be worn as accessories, like dangling from a brooch or tied to a belt. People also chewed on aromatic herbs like mint, cloves or parsley to freshen breath, or at least try to. Some ground salt or ashes and rubbed them directly on their teeth using cloth or fingers. In Muslim regions, the miswak stick, a natural toothbrush made from tree twigs, was widely used and far more effective than anything Europe had going on. There were also tooth powders, mixtures of herbs, charcoal and ground bones that were rubbed onto the teeth for a brushing effect. They weren't pleasant, but they were better than nothing. In noble households, this might be combined with rinsing your mouth with vinegar or wine. Not water, never water. Remember, people thought water could bring disease, especially cold water. So if you wanted a rinse, you reached for your wine goblet. Because nothing says oral health like swishing with Merlot. Still, no amount of scraping and rinsing could stop the inevitable. Sugar, while rare for most people, did creep in through dried fruits, honeyed pastries, or those wealthy enough to afford imports. Combine that with bad genetics, no dental care, and a diet heavy in coarse bread and meat, and you've got a recipe for molars that rot faster than a summer apple. Here's your quirky fact for the day. Medieval skulls, actual ones dug up from real cemeteries, often show surprisingly straight teeth. Crooked teeth, which are common today, weren't nearly as prevalent back then. Why? Likely because people chewed tougher, fibrous foods from a young age, which helped naturally align the jaw and wear teeth down evenly. But don't mistake straight for healthy. Those same skulls often have giant abscesses, deep cavities, and entire rows of missing teeth. There's also a lot of scholarly back and forth about whether medieval people cared about their breath. Some believe that bad breath was just expected. Everyone had it, so no one was offended by it. Others argue that people did try to manage it, especially among the wealthy or when courting a potential partner. After all, no one wants to kiss someone who smells like boiled eel and despair. In medieval medicine, bad breath, photoris, was considered a symptom, not just a social nuisance. Physicians might diagnose it as a sign of excess bile, stomach rot or poor digestion. The solution? Bloodletting, purging or chewing certain herbs to rebalance the humours. Because everything came back to the humours eventually. If you're vomiting and can't chew, not a toothache, definitely an imbalance of yellow bile. As you walk through the bustling town square, you pass a vendor selling dried figs and notice that he's completely toothless. His cheeks have collapsed inward like a raisin left in the sun too long. He smiles anyway. His gums are dark and his breath could peel paint. But he seems happy, maybe relieved not to deal with toothaches anymore. The rest of his teeth probably made their exit with the help of strong ale and a hot poker. Meanwhile, you catch a glimpse of a young noblewoman passing by with her hand delicately covering her mouth. It's a common gesture, half modesty, half odour management. You wonder if she's hiding a blackened molar or just trying to keep from inhaling the breath of the scribe walking beside her, who's explaining parchment prices with enough halitosis to kill small birds. And the thing is, no one blames them. You don't either. You can't. There's no toothbrush in your pocket, no mint in your mouth. Your own teeth feel fuzzy after a single day in this world, like they've grown a tiny sweater made of bread crust and regret. You'd kill for a floss pick, but here, the best you can hope for is a twig and a prayer. The sun's starting to lower now, casting long shadows across the street as the scent of roasting meat drifts through the air, mercifully drowning out the mouth funk for a moment. But it'll be back. After all, in the Middle Ages, dental hygiene wasn't a daily routine. It was a distant dream, buried beneath layers of lie, legend, and a whole lot of clove-chewing optimism. You're leaning against a crumbling stone wall now, one eye on the road and the other on a group of people clustered around a barrel fire. It's not cold, not really, but they're all gathered close, not for heat, but for what's slowly becoming clear. They're avoiding the air, or rather, trying to override it. You catch a whiff of something vaguely herbal drifting from the fire, rosemary, maybe sage, and realise they're burning bundles of dried plants just to make the space around them smell less terrible. Welcome to the medieval relationship with scent, where the nose wasn't just a sensory organ, it was a social referee. In a world without showers, deodorant or clean socks, scent became a powerful form of communication. How you smelled said more about you than anything you could possibly wear. Body odour wasn't just an unfortunate reality, it was a cultural signal. Were you healthy, holy, poor, diseased? You didn't need to open your mouth to tell people. Your armpits spoke volumes. You pull your cloak tighter, not because you're cold, but because you can smell yourself now. The sharp tang of dried sweat and damp wool clings to you like a second skin, and you're not alone. Everyone around you carries their own cloud of scent. That merchant over there, garlic, ale and horses, the woman selling apples, a faint hint of lavender battling something suspiciously barn-like. The priest, incense and mildew with just a suggestion of old leather and long, unwashed hair. It's a pungent buffet, and you've got front row seats. But here's the thing, in the Middle Ages, people did notice bad smells. The myth that no one had any idea they reeked? False. They knew. They talked about it. They wrote about it. They just had very different ideas about what the smells meant, and which ones were acceptable. Take the concept of miasma, the belief that disease was spread through foul air. Not germs, not microbes, just bad smells. If something stank, it was probably dangerous. And so people developed all kinds of coping strategies to protect themselves from these invisible death clouds. Carrying pomanders, little metal or ceramic balls filled with herbs and spices, became popular among the wealthy. You'd wear it on your belt or around your neck like a medieval AirPod, except instead of playing music, it played Don't Die from the Plague. Common folk had their own tricks. They'd hang bunches of herbs in windows, stuff rosemary or lavender into their clothes, or chew on mint while walking through a particularly nasty street. Some even carried sponges soaked in vinegar and pressed them to their noses during outbreaks. Not for cleanliness, again that wasn't the priority, but to avoid breathing in what they believed was poisoned air. And oh, the social consequences of smelling wrong. If you stank too much, like really stank, even by medieval standards, you could be ostracised. Smell became a kind of moral judgment. A good Christian was supposed to live modestly, but not filthily. There was a line. Crossing it meant something was wrong with your soul. People might accuse you of being diseased, cursed, or even possessed. Women were especially scrutinised. A man could sweat like a pig and still be considered respectable. A woman who smelled even slightly off, sinful, tempting, or both. It was a no-win situation soaked in sweat and double standards. Here's a quirky historical nugget. Some matchmakers and midwives were said to be able to diagnose a woman's marital readiness based on scent alone. Not just the usual suspects, breath, armpits, but more personal areas. It sounds insane, but this idea of sniffing out fertility or virtue was a real thing. Smell wasn't just a social marker. It was sometimes treated like a full-blown diagnostic tool. Of course, none of this stopped people from, well, smelling. Even the cleanest person, freshly scrubbed and wearing their best perfumed robe, couldn't stay fresh for long. Sweat started the moment you got dressed. Wool absorbed everything. Linen yellowed. Leather belts absorbed body oils and never gave them back. And once you started layering clothing for warmth, you created a portable sauna that marinated you in your own scent all day long. So what did people do? They adapted. They learned to live with their own smell and each other's. They ranked smells, filed them away in their brains. You'd know your friends not just by sight or voice, but by the particular combination of ash, animal, and herb they carried around. Your mother's scent might be smoke and onions. Your neighbour? Beer and mildew. Your crush? Bread oven and faint roses. Scent memory, medieval style. There's a fascinating scholarly debate around how exactly medieval people perceived smell. Some argue that they were simply desensitized, like how a baker doesn't notice the smell of yeast after an hour. Others say they were acutely aware of scent, and used it to form judgments about everything from class to character. And then there are the medical theorists of the time who believed that smell could alter your humours. Breathe in too much foul air and your blood might go sour. Inhale a sweet aroma, you might feel uplifted, cheerful, even cured. Which explains why medieval doctors often prescribed smelling things as actual treatments. Headache? Sniff vinegar-soaked wool, melancholy. Try cloves or cinnamon, plague. Stuff your nose with crushed herbs and hope for the best. They didn't have antibiotics, but they had a strong faith in the power of good-smelling things to save lives. You pass a street vendor now who's boiling apple peels and herbs in a cauldron over a small fire. He's selling cups of the aromatic steam to passers-by, 1 penny per sniff. A woman steps up, leans over the pot, and breathes in deeply like it's the finest perfume. She sighs, smiling faintly, and hands over her coin. You try it too. It doesn't make you cleaner. It doesn't even really make you smell better. But for a moment, your nose is full of warm apple and mint, and the rest of the world, its stink, its sweat, its foul breath and rotting shoes just fades. It's a tiny comfort, but in this world that's enough. You're moving through the marketplace now, weaving between carts loaded with cabbages, baskets of overripe figs, and what may or may not be a pile of pickled eels. The smells twist together into something almost comically foul, sweet, sour, earthy, and vaguely alarming. But none of it compares to the tension hanging in the air like smoke. People are whispering. Eyes dart to the horizon. A man with a wheelbarrow full of turnips drops them all in the mud when he hears a single word. Plague. It's here. Or close. No one knows for sure. Word travels faster than reality in the Middle Ages, but when it does arrive, there's no mistaking it. One day you're scratching a flea bite, and the next your neighbour's being carted away with a lump the size of a plum on his neck. Welcome to one of the darkest chapters of medieval life, the Black Death, where hygiene wasn't just poor, it was catastrophic. It's 1347, or 1348, or 1349 depending on where you are. The plague hits in waves, crashing through towns and villages like a sick wind. And if you think your hygiene habits were questionable before, wait until you see what happens during a full-blown pandemic with zero understanding of germs and a deep-rooted fear of water. People panic, naturally, but instead of washing their hands and staying home, 2 things they would have found suspicious anyway, they turn to the tools they do have: prayers, bloodletting, flagellation, and wildly unhelpful advice. One physician swears by not bathing at all, claiming that hot water opens the pores and lets the plague in. Another advises carrying a sponge soaked in vinegar and rose water, tied to a stick like a smelly security blanket. And public health measures? Let's just say they're creative. In some towns, they burn piles of aromatic herbs in the streets, hoping the smoke will drive away the evil air. Others order people to stay indoors, except that they don't close the markets, or the churches, or the bathhouses. One village tries ringing a bell every time someone dies, which means the town eventually starts sounding like an off-key symphony of doom. It's the worst kind of reality show. Who's next? Plague Edition. And if you're thinking the bathhouses might help, think again. By now, those once social hubs of hot water and gossip are seen as outright dangerous. All that steam, all those people breathing and sweating in close quarters, it's a recipe for disaster. Except, of course, no one knows it's the fleas, or the rats, or the bacteria. They just know that people bathe and then die. That's enough. Many bathhouses close. Others are burned. Hygiene practices, already shaky, collapse under the weight of fear. There's a bitter irony here. Some scholars believe that if people had increased their washing, their laundering, their pest control, even by medieval standards, the spread might have slowed. But instead, they went the other way. The cleaner you were, the more open you were to infection. Dirty skin, thick clothing, and layers of sweat were believed to block the bad air. You weren't just filthy, you were fortified. And then come the plague doctors, the beaked figures of nightmare legend. You spot one crossing the square now, his long robe fluttering like a shadow. His mask has glass eyes and a curved beak stuffed with strong-smelling herbs, mint, camphor, cloves. He thinks it's filtering the poison air. It isn't. But at least he smells better than most. Sort of. His presence means death has been confirmed nearby. You step back, heart racing a little now as people begin to scatter. Some head toward the church, others run for the town gates, clutching bundles and dragging children behind them. A woman kneels in the mud and starts praying to Saint Sebastian. Loudly. Between sobs, she's also coughing. You take another step back, because now you know the symptoms: fever, buboes, blackened skin, vomiting, death in 2 or 3 days if you're lucky. The irony is that in a world already plagued by poor hygiene, the arrival of the actual plague exposed just how ill-equipped anyone was to fight a real biological threat. Remember the old belief in miasma? That bad smells caused illness? Well, it led people to do some very odd things, like killing their cats, Yes, in an effort to stop the plague, some towns began exterminating stray animals, especially cats, which were associated with witchcraft, which meant the rats and their infected fleas got free rein to party through every home and barn and monastery. But even beyond superstition, hygiene just wasn't set up to meet the moment. Clothes weren't washed often enough to kill fleas, water was hoarded but not boiled, soap was a luxury, and pest control consisted of hoping your dog was hungry enough to chase something besides your leftover stew. Want a fringe fact to really round out the horror? Some physicians recommended not changing your clothes at all during an outbreak. They believed that disturbing the skin or agitating the humours could make you more susceptible. So people wore the same garments day after day, until they were stiff with sweat, filth and sometimes pus. That's not just unhygienic, it's practically gift-wrapping your immune system for a plague party. And yet, in the middle of all this, there were tiny, weird efforts at staying clean. Some wealthier households would burn linen or hang it in the sun. Others would spritz themselves with herbal water. In cities with organised leadership, you might see attempts to clean the streets or isolate the sick. Quarantine becomes a word people learn the hard way. Doors are marked with crosses. Food is passed through windows on wooden spoons. Still, most people just hope to survive. Hygiene became symbolic, a ritual gesture rather than a real barrier against disease. You could perfume your clothes, burn incense, splash your face with rose water. But none of it stopped the plague. And as the weeks go on, the death toll climbs. Graves fill, bells toll, silence spreads, and in the middle of it all, people begin to fear cleanliness itself. The idea that water, herbs, or air could save them fades beneath the weight of superstition, trauma, and loss. You move through the emptying street now, watching as shutters close and candles are snuffed. The town smells sharper now, death has a scent. Sweet, metallic, unmistakable. It clings to your clothes like smoke, and you understand something unsettling. The plague wasn't just a biological disaster. It was a cultural one. It unravelled what little hygiene existed, deepened fear, and convinced an entire continent that maybe dirt wasn't the enemy after all. Maybe, they thought, it was protection. You pass the town's midwife on the road, her apron stiff with old stains, hands red from the cold and eyes lined by too many sleepless nights. She gives you a look, not unfriendly but guarded, and then disappears into a cottage where a woman is screaming behind a shuttered window. Judging by the sound, someone is giving birth or dying. In the Middle Ages, those two things were often the same, and if you think hygiene was rough in general, just wait until you step into the world of medieval women's health. You push open the door to a one-room cottage and duck your head as the heat and smell smack you like a wet blanket. There's a woman lying on a straw-stuffed bed, drenched in sweat, gripping a twisted cloth between her teeth. The midwife kneels between her legs, surrounded by bowls of boiled water, thread, linen, rags, and what appears to be a knife that hasn't seen soap since the last full moon. There's no doctor, no sterile tools, no gloves, just instinct, prayer, and a lot of hoping things don't go sideways. Welcome to medieval women's hygiene, where menstruation, pregnancy and childbirth came with a side order of confusion, superstition and body horror. It wasn't just that resources were limited, it was that the entire conversation around women's bodies was shrouded in shame and a deep, abiding fear of anything that might resemble autonomy. Let's start with menstruation. Most people didn't talk about it, at least not publicly. When they did, it was usually in the context of sin, medicine, or straight-up panic. The dominant theory of the time was based on the four humours, and menstruation was seen as a form of purging excess blood. If a woman didn't menstruate regularly, she was believed to be in danger of illness, or madness. But if she bled too much, she was seen as unstable, dangerous, or possibly cursed. So what did women use? Forget tampons. Forget disposable anything. Most used makeshift rags, strips of linen, wool, or whatever cloth they could spare. Some tied them to belts, others stuffed them between layers of underclothes. The wealthy might have custom-sewn pads, washed and reused discreetly. The poor? They often bled directly into their clothes and hoped no one noticed. Or if they did, that they didn't care. And yes, there were medieval recipes for cleaning after a period. Some involved rose water. Others called for vinegar or herbal infusions. Some suggested stuffing garlic inside the body to balance the womb. There are actual texts that recommend powdered toad for menstrual cramps, not to ingest, just to wear. Somewhere. You don't ask too many questions. Then there's the issue of childbirth. which was less a medical procedure and more a high-stakes gamble. You were expected to deliver at home, with a midwife and maybe a neighbour or two. There were no hospitals, no anaesthesia, no sterile surfaces. Women gave birth in the same beds they slept, bled, and had sex in. Sometimes even in stables, kitchens, or on the dirt floor, especially if labour came quickly or unexpectedly. Clean linens were a luxury. A birthing sheet might be reused dozens of times between neighbours. Still, midwives knew what they were doing at least as much as they could. They boiled water, used wine or vinegar to wash tools, and knew how to cut and tie an umbilical cord with materials that wouldn't instantly kill the baby. But infection was common, so was hemorrhaging, and there was no concept of germs. If a woman survived birth, she was considered lucky. If the baby lived, it was a miracle. The church usually showed up later to bless or bury, and don't even get started on postpartum care. Women were expected to church a few weeks after delivery, brought back to church for a ritual cleansing and blessing. Why? Because childbirth was considered spiritually polluting. Forget the trauma. Forget the strength it took to survive. You were still unclean. You needed divine permission to rejoin society. Even bathing was regulated during this time. Some believed postpartum women should avoid water entirely to close the pores. Others insisted warm herbal baths were vital to flush out residual womb toxins. Confused yet, so were they. Medical texts written by monks tried to apply humour theory to women's health, despite having never seen a womb. Meanwhile, actual women had to figure things out with trial, error, and oral tradition. And then there's contraception, or the lack thereof. Yes, people did try to prevent pregnancy, and no, it wasn't always condemned. There were herbal remedies, barrier methods involving wool or animal bladders, and a whole array of rituals that ranged from mildly effective to completely bonkers, like standing on one leg after sex, or sneezing aggressively. Some women carried amulets or herbs tucked in their bodices to ward off conception. Midwives knew which plants could help induce miscarriages, though that came with enormous risk, both physically and legally. There's an open scholarly debate about how much autonomy medieval women actually had in managing their reproductive health. Some argue that midwives and female herbalists held significant power, passing down knowledge outside the reach of male-dominated medicine. Others point out how quickly that power was crushed by the church, especially during witch hunts, where women who knew too much about birth, herbs, or female anatomy were suddenly seen as threats. One moment you're the town's most trusted midwife, the next you're being accused of dancing naked with demons in the forest. You move through the cottage, trying not to stare as the midwife cuts the cord with a cleanish blade and wraps the baby in a blanket that's already soaked through. The new mother doesn't cry, she just exhales, exhausted, pale, barely conscious. Someone pours her a cup of weak ale. Water isn't trusted. Remember, and someone else begins to mop the blood from the floor with straw. You step back outside into the open air. It smells no better, but at least it's not thick with afterbirth and burnt linen. And you realise something. For medieval women, hygiene wasn't just about survival. It was about control in a world that gave them so little. Keeping clean, managing a period, surviving childbirth, these were quiet acts of resistance, of resilience. And though the systems around them were flawed, brutal, and often absurd, these women still learned, still adapted, and still carried on, in spite of everything, especially the smell. The castle rises ahead of you, a hulking beast of stone and mortar, looming over the muddy sprawl of the town. From a distance it looks majestic, turrets reaching for the clouds, banners fluttering in the wind, guards standing tall on the parapets. But as you get closer, the illusion starts to unravel. The air grows dense, the smell shifts, and suddenly, you're realising that just because someone wears a crown doesn't mean they smell like roses. Welcome to the inside of a medieval castle, where wealth doesn't always buy his own soap, and even royalty can reek. You cross the drawbridge and step into the outer ward. Horses snort in their stables. Smoke wafts from the kitchen chimneys. The clang of metal echoes from the blacksmith's forge, all very regal. Until you catch a gust of wind from somewhere deeper inside, you gag. That's not roasted meat. That's not anything you'd want near your face. That's the collective stink of centuries of questionable plumbing decisions, too many people packed into stone rooms, and an elite class that had plenty of money, but very few ways to spend it on actual cleanliness. Let's set the record straight. Just because you were a noble didn't mean you were clean. Sure, you had access to finer fabrics, perfumed oils, and maybe even a servant dedicated to brushing your hair. But castles were still cold, drafty, smoke-choked fortresses with limited water supply and very few proper toilets. And if you think the peasants were living in filth, don't worry, the nobles were just as crusty. They just did it while wearing silk. You're led through the main hall, a high-ceilinged chamber hung with faded tapestries that were meant to block the chill, but now mostly serve as dust and moth traps. A fire crackles in the hearth, pushing out heat and a thick plume of smoke. It has nowhere to go. The chimney only half works, so the air in here is more fog than atmosphere. A servant is sweeping rushes off the floor, old brittle reeds mixed with dried herbs. They were supposed to freshen the room. Now they just rustle underfoot, soaked with spilled wine, meat grease, and whatever the dog dragged in last week. Ah yes, the rushes. Let's talk about those. Instead of cleaning the stone floors, people just threw down layers of rushes to soak up the mess. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of carpet, except it is made of swamp grass and never gets vacuumed. Every so often, maybe once a season if someone's feeling ambitious, they'd peel off the top layer and throw down fresh ones. The bottom? Rotting, mouldy, home to fleas, and possibly sentient. As you move deeper into the castle, the air gets funkier, not necessarily worse, just more concentrated. There's the kitchen scent, stale butter, blood and ash. Then the meat hall scent, spilled ale, sweaty armour, and that one uncle who never leaves. And finally the sleeping quarters. You duck into a chamber lined with ornate wooden panelling, and a massive canopy bed that looks majestic until you get close. The mattress is stuffed with straw. The sheets haven't been changed since the last feast. And above you, a canopy not to block light, but to keep bugs and rats from dropping onto your face while you sleep. Yes, that was an actual concern. Castles were full of vermin. Rats, mice, fleas, lice, all of them making their homes right alongside the nobility. And why wouldn't they? You've got breadcrumbs, fur pelts, warm stone crevices, and people who bathe maybe twice a year. It's rodent heaven. And the sanitation situation. Let's just say the architect was more concerned with defence than drainage. Which brings us to the castle toilets, or as they were known, garderobes. These were essentially stone closets built into the exterior walls, with a long drop into a pit or directly outside into the moat. Yes, the moat. That lovely defensive water feature you always imagined full of fish and mystery is actually full of poop. Human waste, chamber pot dumps, dead animals, you name it. That's what surrounds the castle. So much for drawing inspiration from the view. Inside the garderobe there's a wooden seat with a hole in it. Maybe some moss or straw nearby to wipe with if you're lucky. No privacy, no sewage system, just gravity and hope. And during feast days or big events, the lines for the garderobe stretch down the hall. Not ideal when you're wearing layers of heavy velvet and a full-body undergarment tied in 15 different places. Now some nobles did try to maintain a certain level of cleanliness. A queen might have a personal maid tasked with washing her hair every few weeks using eggs, rosewater or diluted lye. A lord might change his linen underclothes more often than the average peasant. And perfumes. Oh, the perfumes. Lavender sachets sewn into tunics, rose oil dabbed behind the ears, ambergris worn around the neck to disguise the scent of armpits and fear. But all of it was just surface level. You couldn't perfume away mould, or rats, or the bodily consequences of eating 15 kinds of meat in one sitting. There's an ongoing debate among historians about just how clean the upper class really was. Some argue that nobles bathed more frequently than the average villager, especially if they had access to private tubs and heated water. Others say this was mostly performative. The water had to be hauled in bucket by bucket. Heating it took hours. Once it was used, that was it. Draining the tub meant dumping it out a window or into the moat. Not exactly a sustainable spa routine, and bathing was, once again, tangled up in morality. Church officials warned that frequent baths might lead to sinful thoughts. Nudity, especially among mixed company, was a gateway to temptation. So even if you wanted to bathe regularly, you had to navigate the tricky politics of not seeming too proud, too vain, or too worldly. You step out onto the battlements now, the wind finally cutting through the stink like a cold knife. Below, the village continues its dance of survival, children playing in the mud, pigs trotting down the road, women hauling buckets of water past a man dumping slop into the street. The castle may be elevated, both literally and socially, but it's built on the same foundation of filth as everything else. You realise as you breathe in the fresh air that the nobles weren't cleaner, they were just more decorated. Same fleas, better shoes, same chamber pots, fancier handles, and if anything, their wealth allowed them to layer the grime. Perfume on sweat, silk on soot, pride on top of all of it. The myth of the clean, graceful medieval noble? Yeah, let's go ahead and scrub that one right off the history books, assuming we can find some soap. You're standing in a narrow stone corridor now, staring at a wooden door with an iron latch. It looks unassuming, tucked into the side of the wall like a storage closet. There's no grand sign, no instructions, no throne, but make no mistake, you're looking at the medieval toilet. Or as it was called back then, the garderobe. Robe. And yes, that word sounds fancy. Almost like a wardrobe. That's because sometimes, brace yourself, it was both. You unlatch the door and step inside. It's a small chamber, barely wide enough for you to stretch your arms. There's a wooden bench with a hole cut in the middle, and a very, very questionable draught of air rising up from it. That's because this little engineering wonder opens directly to the outside. Below, a sheer drop into a cesspit, a moat, or just a patch of unlucky earth. Congratulations, you've discovered gravity-powered plumbing medieval style. Using the garderobe isn't just about relieving yourself, it's an experience. First, you've got layers to navigate. Tunics, hose, maybe a shift or underpants if you're fancy. Then you squat precariously balanced over a cold wooden hole that feels slightly too large and definitely too haunted. There's no seatbelt, no handrails, just you, your dignity, and the hope that you don't drop your dagger, your hat, or, God forbid, yourself. And it's not like these things were conveniently located. Often garderobes were built high up, either in the corners of castles or built into overhanging projections called murder holes. Yes, that's a real term. The idea was to let waste fall as far from living quarters as possible, usually into a moat or trench. But that didn't always go according to plan. Wind was a factor. So was splashback. So was the unfortunate reality that someone might be down there when you decide to go. You peek down the shaft. It's dark, dank, and echoing with the dripping misery of centuries. Some castles had multiple guardrobes arranged in vertical stacks, meaning that if you were on the bottom floor, well, may the saints have mercy on your soul. And your hair. Now here's the kicker. Guardrobes weren't just used for bodily business. As the name suggests, they were sometimes used to store clothes. Yep. Medieval folks believed that the strong smell of human waste repelled moths and other pests, so it became common to hang cloaks or furs near the opening. You heard that right. Mothballs by way of poop. It's a bold move, but one that speaks to the sheer level of adaptation in a time when pest control meant out-stinking the pests. And wiping? Oh, now we're getting personal. Toilet paper did not exist. The choices were creative. Moss, straw, rags, hands, broken pottery shards. Yes, in some regions this was a real thing. If you were a noble, maybe a soft bit of cloth you'd reuse, because disposable anything wasn't a concept yet. In more desperate times, you'd just shift your weight and let the breeze take care of the rest. There are even records of people using corn cobs, hay, or old feathers. It's not glamorous, it's barely functional. But it was life. Still, the very existence of guardrobes was a step up, literally, from what most people used. The average peasant didn't have a dedicated toilet space. They went in the woods, or behind the house, or into a bucket, which got emptied into a ditch or the street. Some villages had communal latrines, often little more than a covered pit with planks. Chamber pots were common, ceramic or wooden bowls kept under the bed or in the corner, ready for midnight emergency. These. In the morning, dumped out the window, usually with a polite shout of "Garde à l'eau," which basically means "watch out for the water." Spoiler, it was not water. So the idea that castles had these luxurious bathrooms? Kind of a stretch. Sure, they were inside the walls. Sure, they were foul sometimes, but they didn't flush. They didn't clean themselves. And they weren't immune to backflow, blockages, or freezing over in winter. Picture trying to go to the bathroom during a snowstorm with your bare behind inches from an icy wind tunnel. Suddenly, chamber pots are sounding pretty good. Let's throw in a fringe fact just for fun. There are documented instances of people being assassinated while using the guardrobe. The most famous example? Wenceslaus III of Bohemia, allegedly stabbed to death while sitting on his toilet. Because if you're going to go out with a story. Medieval toilets didn't just smell dangerous, they were dangerous. No locks, no alarms, no reinforced doors, just a really unfortunate place to be caught with your hose down. Now, modern historians argue about how often guardrobes were actually used versus chamber pots or outhouses. Some say they were mainly for show or reserved for nighttime or bad weather. Others believe they were used daily, especially in castles with staff to clean them out. Yes, someone had to clean them out, usually a servant, a gong farmer, or some poor soul who drew the worst lot of the week. And cleaning? Don't imagine bleach and sponges. Cleaning meant scooping sludge, airing out rooms, burning herbs, or layering more rushes on the floor to mask the odour. Some guardrobes were designed to be self-cleaning by routing rainwater through them. But if the water dried up, well, tough luck. Nature would just have to take its time. As you exit the garderobe, blinking in the sunlight like you've just returned from battle, you notice something surprising. No one reacts, because here, this is normal. There's no shame in it, no privacy expectation, no scented candles. Going to the bathroom was part of life, done wherever and however you could. And if it stank, well, everything else did too. You walk past another garderobe at your tower, and a boy is already climbing up with a bucket of herbs and a long stick. He's on maintenance duty. You wish him luck. Because in a world where plumbing is a luxury and wiping is an adventure, even using the toilet was a test of medieval survival. You're following the scent of something vaguely pleasant now. Something floral, sharp, almost clean. It's like stumbling across a half-buried memory of what soap should smell like. You round a corner and find the source, a woman selling bundles of dried herbs from a cart, lavender, rosemary, thyme, chamomile, sage, all tied with twine, all wilting slightly in the sun, and just behind her, a rack of tiny cloth satchels and a collection of vials filled with homemade perfume. Welcome to the medieval war on odor, where the name of the game isn't getting clean, it's pretending you already are. Make no mistake, this world stinks. It's a combination of human, animal, and seasonal rot, and no one, not even the nobility, gets a pass. But that doesn't mean they just gave up. Far from it. Medieval people developed entire systems to mask the funk, and in the absence of reliable plumbing or regular bathing, they turned to their gardens, kitchens, and travelling apothecaries for the tools to keep up appearances. The basics were simple. You took herbs, usually whatever grew nearby, and used them to perfume your clothes, your breath, your body, or your surroundings. The most common were rosemary, considered protective and fragrant, lavender, which we'd now call a clean smell, and sage, a favourite for masking kitchen odours. Wealthier households might add spices imported from distant lands, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, but for most folks the sense of daily life came from whatever you could grow, dry, and stuff into a pouch. You pick up a sachet from the cart. It's rough linen, tied at the top with a wax cord. Inside, dried mint leaves and crushed rose petals, with a small piece of frankincense for depth, as the woman explains. You give it a cautious sniff. It's not bad. Definitely better than the pigsty scent clinging to your cloak. She offers another, meant to be hung around the neck or pinned inside a tunic. Keeps the death air away, she says. Also helps with flirting. Because yes, scents were social, even romantic. Just as today someone might douse themselves in cologne before a date, medieval folks took similar steps with what they had. A young nobleman might dab rosewater behind his ears. A merchant's daughter might braid sprigs of sweet marjoram into her hair. Some even rubbed their skin with scented oils, both to soften the skin, distract from the underlying scent of, I haven't bathed in 9 days. But the efforts didn't stop at the body. Clothes were perfumed too. You might line your chest with fragrant herbs, or burn incense near your wardrobe. Some women sewed herb bundles directly into their garments. Others kept perfumed pomanders, metal orbs filled with aromatic blends, attached to belts or necklaces like mobile air fresheners. They were especially popular among the rich, who could afford to wear scent as a symbol of wealth and hygiene, even if the last bath they had was during the reign of a previous monarch. And here's a weird twist. Some of the most prized ingredients in medieval perfume were downright disgusting. Enter ambergris, a waxy substance that starts in the gut of a sperm whale and is coughed up, floats around the ocean, and eventually washes ashore smelling like rotting fish. But once aged, it develops a warm, musky scent that holds perfume like nothing else. It was rare, expensive, coveted. And in this world, the smell of refined whale bath was basically the Chanel No. 5 of the day. Similarly, musk was derived from the glands of male deer and used to give perfumes a deeper animalistic edge. and civet, another base note, was extracted from the scent glands of civet cats. So in the Middle Ages, smelling good often meant rubbing your body with the liquefied essence of whatever wild animal happened to have the worst glandular problem. It's equal parts impressive and horrifying. But for those without access to exotic whale secretions, there were still ways to curate your personal aura. Take strewing herbs, for example. These were scattered across floors, especially in wealthier homes, to release pleasant smells when walked on or crushed underfoot. It wasn't exactly Clorox, but it helped, a bit. The idea was to overwhelm the scent of unwashed feet, food waste, chamber pot accidents, and the musty staleness that came from having no ventilation whatsoever. There were even official recipes for scent blends, some of which still exist. Manuscripts from monasteries and noble courts outlined formulas for cleansing balms and perfumed waters, usually made by steeping flowers or herbs in vinegar or wine. Some were medicinal, others were purely cosmetic, and a few walked the line between health and witchcraft, especially if made by women outside of church approval. Scholars still debate how widespread these scent practices were. Some argue they were mostly confined to the elite. Others suggest even peasants had their own scent rituals, especially during festivals or holy days. After all, if you're going to mass, you don't want to smell like the barn you slept next to. And even the poorest households had access to wild herbs, a handful of mint, a sprig of thyme, maybe a burned stick of juniper. These were small comforts in a very fragrant world. One quirky belief that pops up again and again is the idea that smell could ward off disease. It wasn't just a preference, it was protection. If you smelled nice, or at least smelled strongly, you were thought to be less vulnerable to miasma, the invisible bad air that carried illness. That's why doctors wore those famous beaked masks stuffed with herbs, because scent, they believed, could shield them from death. You walk on now, the sachet still in your hand. The scent fades quickly, but for a moment it feels like armour. Not strong armour, not the kind that stops arrows, but the kind that helps you pass by someone on the street without gagging, and that counts for something. As you pass a line of pilgrims heading toward the chapel, you notice that many of them carry herb bundles tied to their staffs. One man wears a garland of rosemary around his neck like a crude necklace. Another woman rubs a clove into her teeth, her breath probably the freshest within 50 miles. And whether it's for health, holiness or habit, they're all trying, in their own way, to hold the stink of life at bay. Perfume didn't make them clean, it made them bearable. And in a time when water was feared, soap was a luxury, and rats were a feature of every room, smelling vaguely of flowers or spices wasn't just vanity. It was strategy. You tuck the sachet into your tunic, breathe in the last trace of rosemary and mint, and keep walking. You round a corner and find yourself face to face with a man in a blood-stained apron, holding what looks suspiciously like a razor in one hand and a bloodied cloth in the other. He grins, revealing a row of teeth that would make a horse flinch, and gestures toward a creaky stool beside a barrel of grimy water. "Next!" he barks. And just like that, you found yourself in one of the most terrifying, fascinating, and unexpectedly multi-purpose places in medieval life. The barber's shop. Except, it's not just for haircuts. In the Middle Ages, the local barber wasn't just the guy you visited for a trim and a shave. He was also your go-to for minor surgery, dentistry, bloodletting, bone setting, abscess lancing, and the occasional boil popping. Yes, you heard that right. Your local stylist was also your surgeon, and somehow people just went with it. Welcome to the world of the barber-surgeon, where you could lose a molar, a pint of blood, and half your beard in the same 30-minute appointment. You hesitate, eyeing the tools laid out on a stained cloth: scissors, razors, forceps, hooks, something that looks like it was stolen from a blacksmith. None of it looks clean, some of it looks haunted, but there's a long line behind you and a man with a swollen cheek in front, so you sit, cautiously. Your barber wipes his hands on his apron and pulls out a comb that might have last touched a living scalp sometime during the last crusade. He starts by spritzing your hair with water from the barrel. Not fresh water, mind you. Just water, then begins combing through your hair with the sort of intensity usually reserved for livestock grooming. You're immediately covered in bits of dandruff, a suspicious louse or two, and a sense of dread. Then the shave begins. There's no soap, no warm towel, just a blade that may or may not be sharp enough to slice bread. He stretches your skin with one hand and scrapes with the other, occasionally pausing to spit on the blade or wipe it on his sleeve. The experience is somewhere between exfoliation and medieval torture. but by the end of it, you're a little smoother, a little redder, and probably a little infected. Then it gets weird, because just as you're about to leave, another man stumbles in, clutching his side. He pulls up his tunic to reveal a festering wound, purple, swollen, leaking. The barber barely reacts. He nods, points to the stool you just warmed, and grabs a different set of tools. You, meanwhile, decide it's time to stand very far away. This is where the dual role of the barber-surgeon really comes into focus. With physicians often limited to the rich and mostly reading books rather than treating patients, barbers filled the gap. They knew how to bleed a person, pull a tooth, lance an abscess, drain a cyst, and even, on occasion, amputate a limb. Were they trained? Not really. But they had experience, and in a time when formal medical education involved more astrology than anatomy, experience counted for a lot. You glance at the red and white pole spinning lazily outside the shop. It's not just decoration, it's a symbol, red for blood, white for bandages. The pole itself, a representation of the stick patients would grip during bloodletting to keep from passing out. Yes, the famous barber pole is a literal monument to how often these guys made people bleed. Charming, right? Now here's your fringe fact of the day. Bloodletting wasn't just popular, it was practically the universal prescription for everything. Headache, bleed. Fever, bleed. Sadness, definitely bleed. The belief was rooted in the theory of the four humours again, imbalanced fluids causing disease, and the fastest way to rebalance was to drain some out. Barbers used leeches, knives, or even special bloodletting bowls marked with measurement lines so you knew just how much of yourself you were losing. It was like medieval juicing, but with significantly more screaming. There's an open scholarly debate about how effective barber surgeons really were. Some argue they were reckless, barely trained butchers who did more harm than good. Others suggest they provided essential medical care to those who couldn't afford a university-trained physician. And many believe they fell somewhere in between, surprisingly competent at certain procedures, catastrophically unqualified for others. A barber might save a life by draining an infected wound one day, then kill someone the next by bleeding them dry over a cold. You watch as a young apprentice stokes the fire to sterilise a blade, or at least heat it enough to smoke a bit. Sterilisation as a concept didn't really exist yet, but even medieval people understood that a red-hot knife probably killed whatever invisible demons caused infection. It wasn't science, but it was instinct, and sometimes instinct was all they had. But not everything about the barbershop was terrifying. It was also social, a place where men gathered to swap stories, debate politics, hear news, and share illness horror stories like trading cards. The same man who pulled your rotten tooth might also give you advice on local taxes, curse the king, or set you up with his cousin. You didn't just go to the barber for grooming, you went for connection. You lean against the doorframe now, watching as the next patient winces through a tooth extraction. There's no anaesthetic, just a quick prayer and a large pair of pliers. The crack echoes through the room, the crowd flinches in unison. The barber holds the tooth aloft like a trophy. Blood spatters, someone cheers. Another man immediately sits down and points to his jaw. It's not a medical office, it's a theatre of pain and pride. The smell inside the shop is a mix of iron, sweat and rosemary oil, probably used to mask the scent of infected flesh. You inhale cautiously. It's better than the guard-robe, but only just. Outside, a woman is selling handkerchiefs dipped in vinegar and lavender for those who want to breathe through something less horrifying. You buy one, because you've realised something. Hygiene in the Middle Ages wasn't about comfort, it was about survival, and the barber, with his knives and herbs and unshakable confidence, was a one-man hygiene battalion, cleaning you up, cutting you open, and maybe, if the stars aligned, saving your life. Or at the very least, making sure you look decent at your funeral. You're heading down the main road now, boots squelching through something that's definitely not mud. The street narrows, pinched between timber frame buildings that lean inward, as if conspiring to trap the stink inside. A breeze picks up, and for one glorious second you hope it might carry a hint of fresh air. Nope. It just slaps you in the face with an aggressive mix of manure, spoiled meat, and something faintly human. Welcome to the bustling heart of a medieval city, where the smell of civilization is less freshly baked bread and more open sewer with a garlic. Let's start with the streets themselves. They are not paved. Not really. In larger towns, there might be a few stones lining the main thoroughfare, but for the most part, roads are packed dirt, easily churned into muck by carts, hooves and endless footsteps. Rain doesn't wash anything away, it just stirs it up into a foul stew of animal droppings, chamber pot leftovers and discarded food. Add in the occasional dead rat and the warm summer sun, and you've got a street that doubles as both a shortcut and a punishment. And that's the main street. The alleys? Don't even go there. You pass a woman flinging a bucket of slop from her upper window with all the ceremony of tossing a bouquet. She doesn't shout a warning. Maybe she forgot. Maybe she just doesn't care. The contents hit the ground with a wet splat. You sidestep it. Barely. The smell rises immediately. It's the scent of last night's stew, maybe some vomit. Definitely something that used to be a chicken. It slides toward the open gutter that runs through the centre of the street, which, fun fact, is the city's drainage system. You follow it for a few paces and watch as it meanders past market stalls, the local butcher's shop, and two dogs fighting over a spine. Medieval cities were compact, crowded, and incredibly alive, but also aggressively unwashed. People lived cheek to jowl, with homes, workshops, and shops all piled on top of each other, often sharing walls and waste. Space was promiscuous, privacy was a luxury. Sanitation, a shared nightmare. Chamber pots were emptied into the street, food scraps were tossed out windows, children and pigs played in the same filth without blinking, and the city just kept going, like a massive organism breathing in rot and exhaling commerce. You pass by a tannery next, you smell it before you see it. The reek of animal hides being soaked in lye, piss, and other natural ingredients makes your eyes water. The process of turning animal skin into leather was essential and horrific. Skins had to be softened, scraped and soaked in urine to loosen the hair. Then they were dunked in lime water or fermented dog dung to finish the job. And yes, it smelled exactly like that. The workers look unfazed. You, on the other hand, are trying not to gag in public. Tanneries weren't hidden away. They were often built right into the fabric of the city, usually near a water source, because guess what? The waste had to go somewhere. And in many cases, it went right back into the same river where people bathed, fished and drew water for cooking. You think you're safe if you live upstream? Not if someone dumps their offal at sunrise. It gets worse. You round a corner and catch a glimpse of the butcher's quarter. Rows of carcasses hang from wooden racks, flanked by vats of congealed blood and a floor that squelches with every step. Flies move like smoke, thick and buzzing. A boy is sweeping entrails into a corner where a dog licks them clean. The smell is sweet, sour, metallic, like if meat had a hangover. And this isn't an anomaly. This is normal. Cities ran on meat, leather, fish and people, none of which were refrigerated. Spoilage was just part of the math. You sell it before it rots, or you sell it after and hope no one notices. Spices weren't just for flavour. They were an act of mercy. Here's your fringe fact of the day. In some cities, laws were passed banning people from slaughtering animals inside the city walls. Not for ethical reasons, don't be silly, but because of the stench, and the flies, and the fact that blood and waste would run through the streets into the same gutters that carried human excrement. But these laws were hard to enforce. People needed meat, and butchers needed to work. So the blood kept flowing. The city's waste system, if you can call it that, relied heavily on gravity, time and human indifference. There were public latrines, usually over a stream or cesspit, but they were often filthy, dangerous and rarely cleaned. Most people used chamber pots and emptied them out their windows. In some places, it was customary to shout a warning before dumping. In others, you hoped the street was empty. The term night soil referred to the collection of human waste during the overnight hours. Night soil men, sometimes called gong farmers, would haul it away to be dumped outside the city or, if they were clever, sold as fertiliser. Yes, you could sell your poop, not for much, but hey, waste not, want not. But even with this rudimentary system, the sheer volume of waste overwhelmed the streets. Add in dead animals, rotting food, and the occasional unfortunate person, and medieval cities became the perfect breeding ground for illness. Typhoid, dysentery, cholera, and of course our old friend the plague. Scholars argue about just how bad it really was. Some suggest that cities were filthy but functional, that people were surprisingly adept at managing the mess, with street cleaning ordinances, waste collectors, and water inspectors. Others insist that the evidence, mass graves, recurring plagues, endless complaints in city records, suggests a level of public filth we can barely imagine today. The truth? It was probably both. Cities functioned despite the filth, not because they had mastered it. You step into a covered arcade where a group of merchants are discussing wool prices. They're dressed in fine clothes, fur-lined collars and velvet hats, but beneath that, the same sweat, the same funk. A pile of fish guts in the corner doesn't even register. People just walk past. The smell is part of life, part of the texture of the city. Because in a medieval town, you weren't just surrounded by waste, you were part of it. Everything you ate, wore, threw away or stepped over was part of an unending cycle of grime and survival. Cleanliness wasn't a standard, it was a rumour, a luxury for saints and nobles and maybe the dead. You turn down another alley, careful not to slip, and realise something important. Medieval cities weren't unsanitary because people were stupid. They were unsanitary because there was no other choice. The infrastructure didn't exist, the understanding didn't exist, and the priorities. Well, staying alive mattered more than staying fresh. And that smell following you now, it's not going away, it's woven into the stones. You're crouched beside a wooden table in the corner of a tavern now, sipping something that calls itself ale, but tastes more like wet bread with a hint of regret. Around you the room buzzes with noise. Tankards clanking, dogs barking underfoot, just someone snoring in the corner, possibly alive, but what really catches your eye is the man across from you. He's just finished eating a hunk of cheese with his fingers, wipes them on his tunic, and then, without pause, reaches into a communal bowl of pickled onions. No hand washing, no napkin, just straight from his own face to the food everyone's sharing. Delicious. In modern terms, this is an immediate health violation. In the Middle Ages, totally normal. Let's talk about hand washing, or rather, the impressive lack of it in daily life. In a world where people feared water, distrusted bathing, and only vaguely grasped the idea of contagion, washing your hands wasn't just uncommon. It was sometimes seen as unnecessary or even suspicious. And when it did happen, it was more ritual than hygiene. Sure, there were moments when clean hands were encouraged. Before a meal in noble households, servants might offer guests a basin of warm water, usually with a sprig of herbs floating inside. A token gesture. You dip your fingers, maybe swish them around, pat them dry with the shared cloth and feel terribly refined. But soap? Rarely. Scrubbing? Not really. And for anyone who wasn't rich. You wiped your hands on whatever was closest, your tunic, the dog, the wall, your friend's sleeve, and moved on with your life. You glance around the tavern and notice that no one here is even pretending. The cook wipes her hands on a greasy apron, flips a fish over a fire, and then scratches her scalp like it owes her money. The barkeep's fingernails are black with soot and beer residue. A boy runs from table to table collecting empty mugs with the same hands he uses to shovel hay into the fireplace. If a single person here has touched water today, it's probably because they fell into a barrel. The medieval approach to hands was straightforward. They're tools. They're supposed to be dirty. That's how you know they're doing something. Hands prepared food, dug graves, skinned animals, dressed wounds, and delivered babies, all in a day's work. And the idea that unseen particles, tiny, invisible creatures, might be living on your skin and transferring from one surface to another wouldn't enter the conversation for hundreds of years. There were exceptions, of course. Monasteries and abbeys often had rules about washing before prayer, eating or handling holy items. Some even had the designated lavatoriums, stone basins with flowing water, where monks would clean up before mealtime. But again, this was less about hygiene as we understand it, and more about spiritual purity. Washing your hands didn't prevent illness. It prepared you to meet God, whether through dinner or death. And speaking of illness, let's not forget how suspicious people were of too much washing. You remember that theory about pores being doors for disease? It applied to hands too. If you washed your hands too often, especially with warm water, you might weaken yourself, open yourself up to bad air, or throw your humours out of balance. Cleanliness could be seen as weakness. So while you might scrub before a religious ritual, you definitely wouldn't want to look too polished all the time. People would talk. Here's your quirky fringe fact. In some regions, washing hands excessively was associated with witchcraft. Yep. If you were seen dipping your hands into water more than necessary, neighbours might assume you were performing spells or attempting to cleanse yourself after consorting with unholy forces. Just imagine trying to explain hand hygiene in a world where washing could get you accused of hexing your neighbour's cow. And yet, despite all this, there were moments, brief, isolated, usually upper class, where hand washing was not only accepted but celebrated. Feast days, royal banquets, religious ceremonies. These were times when clean hands became part of the spectacle. Water would be poured over a guest's hands by a servant, collected in a basin, then dried with perfumed cloth. The goal wasn't cleanliness. It was pageantry. Show the room how noble you are. Look, he's even got clean hands. But again, it was a performance. The average peasant, not dipping into scented basins. They were lucky to rinse their hands in rainwater. And if you worked with animals, in a kitchen, or with any kind of waste, hand washing wasn't a finishing touch, it just didn't happen. You'd wipe your hands on your trousers and call it a day, or maybe clean them by handling coarse objects like straw or wood shavings, letting the friction remove the worst of the grime. You walk past a butcher now, his hands dyed permanently pink from a lifetime of blood and sinew. He's eating an apple, no wash in between, just straight from carcass to snack. You try not to think about it. Everyone else around you clearly isn't. There's a scholarly debate about how unclean medieval people actually were in terms of disease transmission. Some argue that the constant exposure to dirt gave people tougher immune systems, that medieval folks were, in a twisted way, more adapted to bacteria than we are. Others insist that the lack of basic hand hygiene is part of why medieval cities were constantly teetering on the edge of epidemic. It's likely both. Some people got lucky, some people didn't, but no one, and I mean no one, was washing their hands before touching your food. That's just not how this world works. You're handed a crust of bread now, passed down the table from hand to hand like a baton in a relay race of unwashed palms. You hesitate for a moment, then take a bite. What's one more layer of invisible filth on top of everything else? At this point, your immune system is either evolving into a superhero or planning your funeral. And as you look around at the sticky mugs, the greasy handles, the food served straight from hand to plate, you realise something oddly profound. Hygiene here isn't about cleanliness, it's about survival through exposure. People aren't avoiding germs, they're building a working relationship with them, one unwashed hand at a time. You're back in a quieter part of town now, where the streets widen just enough to let in a sliver of sunlight, and the air carries more incense than sewage. Ahead stands a stone building with a pointed archway, tall stained glass windows, and a bell tower that looms like a guardian over the city. It's the church, stoic, solemn, and suspiciously clean-looking from the outside. But as you push through the heavy wooden doors, you're stepping into one of the strangest battlegrounds in the history of hygiene, the eternal tension between clean bodies and clean souls. Inside, the church smells of wax, damp stone, and lingering smoke from last week's incense. You inhale, grateful to escape the usual city funk. The interior is dim, echoing with the soft shuffle of footsteps and the occasional creak of pews. This place, more than any other, shaped how people thought about their bodies. Not just what they looked like, but what they meant. And let's be clear, the church in the Middle Ages had a very complicated relationship with washing. On the one hand, cleanliness had clear religious symbolism. Water was sacred, baptism was the gateway to salvation, monasteries had rules about washing before prayer, before meals, and even weekly bathing routines. The idea of purifying the body wasn't foreign to Christianity at all. It was central to many of its rituals. So yes, in theory, the church valued cleanliness. But in practice, it got murky, fast. Because somewhere along the line, washing went from being a symbol of purity to a potential gateway to sin. The act of bathing, especially if it involved nudity, heat, and God forbid, pleasure, became suspect. After all, wasn't the body inherently sinful? Something to be denied, not pampered. The early Christian ideal was rooted in asceticism, avoiding indulgence, punishing the flesh, focusing on the soul. And warm baths, those started to look a little too indulgent. You take a seat near a statue of a saint, his stone face peaceful, his feet missing from centuries of being touched, kissed, or rubbed by pilgrim hoping for a miracle. A few rows ahead, a woman whispers a prayer, clutching a rosary. She smells faintly of lavender and wood smoke, like she tried to mask whatever she couldn't scrub away. You wonder if she bathes regularly. Probably not. Not because she doesn't want to, but because she's been told in one way or another that it might lead her astray. You see, bathing in the Middle Ages started to pick up a reputation. First, it was the idea that frequent washing might open your pores to disease. Thank you, plague panic. Then came the moral fears, that people who bathed too often were vain, obsessed with their bodies, or trying to attract attention in ways the church found inappropriate. Public bathhouses, once accepted gathering places, became known less for hygiene, and more for sin, places of nudity, mixed company, sometimes even sex. There are church records from the 14th and 15th centuries where priests denounce bathhouses outright, calling them dens of immorality. Some councils passed rules forbidding clerics from visiting them. Others tried to regulate when and how people could bathe. The fear wasn't just that people were getting clean, it was that they were enjoying themselves in the process. And enjoyment? That was dangerous. Here's your quirky fact. Some theologians argued that washing the body too frequently showed a lack of humility. After all, saints didn't bathe. St. Agnes went years without washing. St. Thomas Becket wore lice-infested clothing under his robes as a form of holy suffering. The idea was that physical discomfort kept you focused on higher things. Dirt then wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated in certain circles as a sign of virtue. Of course, not everyone agreed. In some Christian texts, cleanliness was associated with godliness. Clean hands and a pure heart, as the saying went. Monasteries, particularly the wealthier ones, built elaborate washrooms and latrines. Some even had rudimentary plumbing systems piping in water for communal baths. But again, these were rare, often restricted to monks, and framed as a form of discipline rather than comfort. This tension between purity and pleasure, between soul and skin, ran deep. You pass a side chapel now, where a confessional box stands empty, its curtain gently swaying. You imagine someone kneeling inside, whispering a list of sins that might include not just gossip or theft, but vanity, pride, washing too often, wearing perfume, looking in a mirror for too long. These weren't harmless indulgences. They were seen as slippery slopes toward damnation. And for women in particular, bodily care was a tightrope. Too dirty, you were uncouth. Too clean, you were seductive. It's one of the reasons feminine hygiene, as you've already seen, was kept quiet, private, tied up in shame and silence, because cleanliness and sexuality weren't separate in the church's eyes. A clean woman was a woman paying too much attention to her body. And a woman paying attention to her body? Trouble. There's an open scholarly debate about whether the church's fear of bathing caused the decline of hygiene in medieval Europe, or whether it just mirrored larger cultural changes. Some historians argue that the decline in public baths had more to do with economics and the rise of disease. Others blame the shift squarely on religious attitudes that turned water into temptation. Either way, the result was the same. People bathed less, trusted water less, and turned to symbolic purification, confession, prayer, penance over physical cleaning. You move toward the back of the church, where a font of holy water sits, its surface still, a faint shimmer under the candlelight. You dip your fingers in. It's cold, clean, at least by medieval standards, a reminder that water still held power here. Spiritual power, not physical. You weren't supposed to bathe in it. You were supposed to touch it, cross yourself and move on. It wasn't for cleaning the dirt off your hands. It was for washing the sins from your soul. As you step back into the street, the contrast hits you like a wall. The filth, the noise, the life, the church was a place of restraint, of denial. Out here, the world is messy and loud and unapologetically human. People scratch themselves openly, pick food from their teeth, spit in the gutter and go about their day. And between the two, between ascetic purity and urban grime, medieval people tried to carve out something resembling balance. You walk on, still thinking about that strange rule. Cleanliness is next to godliness, unless you enjoy it too much. You're moving through the outer courtyard of a large manor now, boots kicking up dry leaves and chicken feathers, when you hear the clink of armour and the soft whinny of horses nearby. A nobleman walks past, flanked by two servants, dressed in rich wool and fur, his hair oiled, his hands gloved. He looks important, regal, clean even. But then you catch a whiff as he passes, like spoiled milk mixed with boiled onions and something that's probably alive. And just like that, the illusion shatters, because even the highest in the land, the dukes, the lords, the monarchs themselves, were not immune to the stench of the Middle Ages. If you're hoping that royalty lived in perfumed splendour while the rest of the world wallowed in mud, let's end that dream right now. Royalty stank, nobles reeked, and palaces, for all their marble facades and gilded ceilings, were often little more than glorified cesspits with curtains. The higher you climbed in social status, the more layers you added, literally. And beneath every layer of velvet ermine and gold-threaded linen was a deeply unwashed human being sweating through their legacy. You follow the nobleman into a great hall where a feast is underway. Servants bustle about with trays of roasted game and pitchers of wine, while courtiers recline on wooden benches, swiping grease from their fingers with whatever fabric is within reach. The air is thick, meat, ale, wet wool, stale perfume and body heat all mingling into a hot fog. At the far end of the room, a noble woman fans herself with a feathered fan, looking bored and slightly nauseous. Whether it's the food or the people around her is unclear. Let's start with the basics. Royal and noble households had access to some of the best hygiene tools of the time: soap, rosewater, scented oils, herbal rinses, clean linens, and servants to administer it all. They could stay cleaner than the average peasant. But could isn't did. Because bathing regularly was still culturally suspicious, and the effort required to heat enough water for a full-body soak was immense, even in a palace. You didn't just turn on a tap. You needed cauldrons, firewood, labour, and patience. A single bath might take hours to prepare. So instead of daily scrubs, royalty relied on dry cleaning methods, rubbing the body with cloths, changing into fresh linen, and masking odour with perfume. And oh, the perfume! The nobility practically bathed in scent. Musk, rose oil, violet water, ambergris, and other pungent substances were dabbed onto necks, wrists, and clothing. Scented gloves became a thing, literally soaked in aromatic oils. Cloaks were lined with sachets of herbs. Some nobles even kept pomanders, tiny perforated containers of fragrant materials, on chains around their waists, swinging like holy air fresheners as they walked. Queen Elizabeth of Hungary famously used a blend of rosemary and wine known as Hungary water to keep herself smelling divine. Whether it worked is anyone's guess. You pause near the royal dais and notice the king's boots, fine leather, polished, but streaked with something that looks suspiciously like duck droppings. His hands, ringed and elegant, are also stained at the fingertips, the remnants of roasted boar perhaps, or the ink from a letter. Hygiene, for the upper class, was a patchwork of appearances. They wanted to look clean, not necessarily be clean. Royal garments were often swapped several times a day, but that didn't mean the people inside them were. Clean clothes gave the illusion of cleanliness, which was almost more valuable than the real thing. Linen undergarments were prized not only for comfort, but because they absorbed sweat and filth, theoretically protecting the outer garments and your social image. After a few wears, they'd be sent off to the laundry, boiled in lye, and beaten senseless until passably clean again. Here's your fringe fact. Noble women were often sewn into their dresses. Yep, the layers of bodice, chemise, and gown were sometimes so tightly tailored that a lady might go days or weeks without fully removing them. Instead, she would shift pieces aside to perform necessary bodily functions and rely on herbal powders and cloths to manage everything else. Imagine the inside of those gowns. Now imagine summer. And don't forget the hair. Hair was oiled, braided, powdered and adorned, but rarely washed. Water was feared for the usual reasons: sickness, sin and inconvenience, so nobles resorted to dusting their scalps with powders made from herbs, chalk or even ground up bones. This gave the appearance of volume and cleanliness while absorbing grease. Lice? Still a problem. But servants were often tasked with combing through their master's hair daily. Plucking out nits and combing away dead skin. Hair care is a team sport. There's a scholarly tug of war over whether nobles were more hygienic than peasants. Some argue that with more resources, they had to be. Others point out that comfort and laziness often won out over the best practices, and that nobles, wrapped in privilege, had less motivation to adapt than the working class. After all, if no one dares tell the prince he smells like rotten cheese, what incentive does he have to change? You wander into the Queen's solar now, a private chamber with silk-covered cushions, a brazier for warmth, and a vanity covered in vials. This is where the illusion of cleanliness is curated. A maid is preparing rosewater, dipping a linen cloth and gently dabbing the Queen's neck. It's not a bath. It's not even a wash. It's just enough to say I'm clean without the effort of becoming it. The chamber pot sits discreetly in the corner, half covered with a cloth. Someone will carry it away later and empty it into a moat or pit. That person will not be the Queen. Her world is carefully constructed to insulate her from the mess of medieval life. But even so, the stench creeps in, through the windows, under the doors, in the food, on the hands of the courtiers who kiss her ring. Royalty could afford anything except a nose blind enough to ignore the reality around them. As you leave the manor, you pass a servant lighting a bundle of herbs in a metal dish to cleanse the Hall of Odours. The smoke wafts through the room, earthy and thick, settling into the tapestries and wooden beams. It doesn't erase the smell, it just adds a layer. And that's the truth of it. Nobles didn't live above the filth. They lived in it, surrounded by silks and songs and heraldry, yes, but also lice, sweat and chamber pots. Cleanliness was a performance, and the better the performance, the less anyone had to acknowledge the rot beneath the crown. You're walking now through a small village on the outskirts of the forest, where the houses are fewer, the air is cooler and the streets are, if not clean, at least quieter. A faint trail of wood smoke curls up from chimneys, and somewhere nearby a rooster crows like he's been doing it since the dawn of time. It almost feels peaceful, until you catch a familiar scent on the breeze. It's not the barn, it's not the pig pen. It's something darker, sharper. You follow your nose toward a cottage with a crude wooden sign hanging from a post, a bar of soap carved into the shape of a skull. Charming. You've stumbled upon the village soap maker, a person who is either revered, feared or pitied, sometimes all three. And after one look at the soap being boiled in a massive iron cauldron over an open fire, you understand why. Because in the Middle Ages, soap was not the fluffy, lavender-scented bar you know and love. It was a bubbling, caustic stew of animal fat, lie and suffering. It was expensive, questionable, and in many cases, more dangerous than the dirt it was supposed to remove. Let's start with the ingredients. Soap, in its most basic medieval form, required two things, fat and alkali. The fat could be tallow rendered from beef or mutton, or lard from pigs, which meant that soap making often began with a trip to the butcher, or the backyard, nothing like chopping up your dinner and your bath in the same afternoon. Then came the lye, which wasn't something you bought in a bag from the store. No, lye was made by filtering rainwater through a barrel of wood ash, usually from hardwoods like oak. The resulting liquid could strip paint, peel skin, or, in the right hands, become soap. You watch the soap maker stir the thick, bubbling cauldron with a long wooden paddle. The smell is a foul blend of scorched fat, smoke, and a weird sour note you can't quite place, probably goat. He tosses in a handful of herbs, rosemary, maybe lavender, probably not to make it smell good, but just to make it smell less horrifying. If you're lucky and rich, you might get soap with olive oil imported from Spain or Italy. But in this village, you're getting goat grease and pine ash. And the final product? A dense, crumbly, greyish bar that looks like something chipped off a wall and smells like death trying to cover itself in flowers. It's rough, alkaline, and if used too often it will stir up your skin like a bad sunburn. You'll be clean, sure, possibly bleeding. Definitely regretting your choices, which is why even if soap existed, very few people used it regularly. You pass by a washerwoman scrubbing clothes with a bar of this stuff, her knuckles raw, her apron wet. Soap for laundry was more common than for bodies. Clothes could take the punishment, skin not so much, and remember, water was hard to come by, hot water even more so. So the idea of slathering yourself in corrosive soap and then rinsing it off with buckets of precious, probably dirty water, not super appealing. But here's your fringe fact. In some parts of medieval Europe, good soap was a highly prized export. In places like Castile, Marseille and Aleppo, soap making became a skilled profession. Olive oil-based soaps were smoother, milder, and sometimes even luxurious. In the Islamic world especially, cleanliness was closely tied to religious practice, and soap was more widely used, more refined, and considered essential. So while much of Christian Europe was embracing filth and spiritual grime, the Muslim world was exporting cleanliness one brick at a time. Unfortunately, that fancy imported soap was expensive, very expensive, so most people just didn't bother. Instead, they relied on dry cleaning methods, literally. They rubbed themselves with cloth or dusted their skin with herbs and powders to absorb sweat. Some even scraped their skin with dull blades or flat stones to remove grime. It wasn't about being clean, it was about not being too dirty. The bar was low, honestly it was buried. And the few who did use soap, they sometimes got in trouble for it. No, really. There are historical records of people being accused of vanity, or worse, heresy, for their dedication to cleanliness. Washing too often, especially with scented soap, raised eyebrows. Who were you trying to impress? Why did you care so much about your appearance? Were you perhaps trying to tempt someone, or hide something? A clean body, they feared, might mean a dirty soul. You walk past a group of children now playing in the mud, faces smeared bare, hands sticky, hair full of leaves. None of them look particularly bothered by their condition. One boy has a smear of something that might be jam or might be blood on his cheek. His mother wipes it away with the corner of her sleeve and sends him running. No soap, no water, just cloth and habit. There's a scholarly debate about how widespread soap use truly was in the Middle Ages. Some argue that soap was more common than we think, just expensive and used as sparingly. Others believe it was a luxury good, only found in monasteries, noble homes, or urban markets. But most agree on this. When it came to bodily hygiene, soap wasn't king. In fact, it barely made the guest list. People preferred to stay dry, to mask odours with perfume or herbs, to rub with cloths, or scrub with sand, or just hope the rain handled it. Soap was for laundry, for shaving, for occasionally dealing with lice, but for daily hygiene, it was more of an idea than a reality. You glance back at the soap maker who's now pouring the mixture into a wooden mould to set. Tomorrow he'll slice it into bars, wrap it in scraps of linen or parchment, and sell it at the market. Someone will buy it, maybe to wash their hands before a feast, maybe to scrub their tunic after a sheep birthing goes sideways, maybe just to say they own soap. Because in this world, that alone is a flex. And as you walk away, the scent of boiled lye and goat fat still clinging to your clothes, you realise something grimly poetic. Medieval people weren't afraid of being dirty. They were afraid of being clean for the wrong reasons. Because when even soap has a reputation, you know you're in a world that doesn't just tolerate filth. It respects it. You found a bench near the edge of the village square. The kind that leans a little too much to one side and creaks like it's keeping secrets. Across from you, a young woman walks by with her hair neatly braided and her face lightly dusted with white powder, probably crushed chalk or flour. A pair of boys run behind her, laughing and covered in mud, and no one blinks an eye. You're watching all this unfold when an older man shuffles past and gives you a long, judging look. Your boots are clean, your tunic is relatively unstained, and in this moment, that makes you suspicious, maybe even dangerous. Because in the medieval world, being too clean didn't mean you were virtuous. It meant you were hiding something. Let's talk about the twisted social politics of being clean in a dirty world. In modern times, someone who bathes regularly, grooms themselves, and smells like a citrus grove is usually applauded. In the Middle Ages, not necessarily. Hygiene was not universally admired, and cleanliness could actually work against you. Too much washing, too much grooming, too much attention to your appearance. It could be taken as a sign of vanity, pride, seduction, or even heresy. You hear it in the whispers. A woman who smells faintly of roses must be trying to tempt someone. A man who wears a spotless tunic is probably wealthy, but what's he hiding under all that perfume? There's a line between maintaining basic hygiene and looking like you're trying too hard, and it's a thin, slippery, ash-covered one. Especially for women, the line between cleanliness and moral suspicion was razor-sharp. A well-groomed woman might be seen as vain, flirtatious, or even immoral. A man who changed his clothes too often might be accused of foppishness or laziness. The working class valued function over form. Hands that were too soft or hair too perfectly arranged meant you weren't doing anything useful. And in a culture where your place in the world was carved out by what you did, labourer, farmer, spinner, cook, appearing too polished could read as dishonesty. You were either putting on airs or trying to rise above your station. Neither was good. You wander past a group of washerwomen hanging linen on lines, their hands red and chapped. They speak in short bursts, sometimes glancing toward a house nearby, a house with a rosebush planted outside and a silk curtain in the window. That's all it takes. Someone who cleans too often, who wears lace, who smells too nice, that person becomes the subject of village gossip. In a world where dirt equals honesty, being too clean means you're not playing fair. There are sermons, actual recorded sermons, where priests warn their congregations against excessive grooming. Washing your body too much could lead to pride. Cleaning your hair too often meant you were concerned with beauty over modesty. Wearing perfume? That was downright scandalous unless you were royalty. And even they weren't off the hook. Royal vanity was often criticised in letters, chronicles, and court gossip. The line between queenly and corrupt was drawn in how much rosewater you used. Here's your quirky fact of the day. There are medieval court records where women were accused of sorcery for their beauty regimens. Using too many herbs, too much oil, or too frequent a wash could get you labelled as a witch, or at least someone dabbling in unnatural things. One woman was accused of casting a love spell simply because her skin was unusually smooth. The charge? She washed with suspicious frequency. Imagine that. Your crime is exfoliating. But this wasn't just about religion or morality. It was also about class and identity. Cleanliness was a marker of wealth, yes, but also of separation. A noble might go through elaborate grooming rituals, but if a peasant did the same, that was seen as pretentious. You were supposed to stay in your lane, and that lane involved grime. It led to a strange cultural balancing act. People wanted to avoid stinking, of course. No one liked lice. No one enjoyed feeling greasy or sticky. But they also didn't want to be perceived as vain, wasteful, or unnatural, so the goal became not to be clean, but to be just clean enough. Enough to be tolerable, enough to get through church without comment, but not enough to get noticed. You step into a small shop where a woman is selling herbal powders and dried flower bundles. She leans in as you browse, whispering, "That one there. Good for under the arms. Smells nice, but not too nice." You raise an eyebrow. She nods, serious. "Don't want folks talking." Even her marketing pitch is calibrated for cultural survival. Don't smell too fresh. Don't draw too much attention. Hygiene in this world isn't self-care. It's social strategy. You pick up a tin of something that smells vaguely like mint and smoke. It's for the breath, she explains. Good before confession. You almost laugh, but then you realise she's right. Looking and smelling a certain way was not about comfort, but about navigating perception. You didn't want the priest thinking you were hiding sins just because you weren't sweating like everyone else. Cleanliness might impress your friends, it might even impress your enemies, but it made the church nervous, and the neighbours very nervous. That's where the tension lies. In the medieval mind, being dirty wasn't just normal, it was authentic. It meant you worked. It meant you weren't seducing anyone. It meant you were focusing on your soul, not your appearance. And most of all, it meant you weren't trying to be something you weren't. To be too clean was to invite scrutiny. To be dirty, that was safety. There was still debate among historians about how far this cultural suspicion of cleanliness went. Some argue it was more pronounced in rural areas. Others say it was widespread, reinforced by religious teachings and economic stratification. But nearly all agree there were unspoken rules. Be modest, be humble, be dusty if possible. Better to smell like sheep dung than get called fancy. As you step back into the square, a man in a richly dyed tunic walks past. He's well-groomed, perfumed and drawing stares. A child points. An old woman shakes her head. You can almost hear the unspoken accusations. Who does he think he is? What is he hiding? Why doesn't he smell like everyone else? You adjust your own cloak, now dusted with ash and hay. You don't mind anymore. Around here, a little filth is the best disguise you've got. You're waking up now in a tiny wooden loft above a tavern stable, and the first thing you feel isn't the cool morning air or the coarse blanket tangled around your legs. It's the itch. A deep, crawling, maddening itch that starts on your scalp, dives behind your ear, slides down your back, and then circles back for another round like it's got nowhere else to be. You sit up, scratch without hesitation, and then realise, yep, you're not alone in here. And no, I don't mean the snoring innkeeper below. I mean the uninvited roommates who've moved into your hair, your clothes, and quite possibly your soul. Meet the medieval trifecta: lice, fleas, and rashes, the holy trinity of discomfort that followed you like loyal pets, no matter your class, gender, or how many layers of linen you wore. The itch, in the Middle Ages, wasn't a temporary annoyance. It was daily life. Constant, ubiquitous. And the worst part? Most people just accepted it. You scratch, you shrug, you move on. Because what are you going to do? Take a bath? Let's start with lice. Head lice were not a sometimes problem. They were a guaranteed problem. Everyone had them. Peasants, nobles, monks, queens. They nested in your hair, your eyebrows, your beard. And because bathing was rare and shampoo wasn't even a dream yet, lice had the run of your body. Combs helped, those narrow-toothed wooden or bone ones. But they were more about controlling the infestation than eradicating it. You combed, squished the lice between your fingernails, flicked them into the fire, and kept going. You stand by a small mirror now, actually just polished metal, and try to examine your scalp. Yep, there's movement. Congratulations, you're officially part of the population. A woman nearby sees your expression and chuckles. They like the warmth, she says, cracking lice between her thumb and forefinger, with the nonchalance of someone peeling an orange. Fleas were arguably worse. They didn't just live in your hair. They lived everywhere. Beds, clothes, floor rushes, pet fur, your boots. They bit constantly and left behind itchy welts that got infected, especially when scratched open by dirty nails. You lift your sleeve and find 3 angry red bumps near your elbow. The price of sleeping in any shared space. Or private space. Or any space with furniture, really. There were even travel manuals. Yes, travel manuals. That advised how to spot flea-infested inns. Spoiler, that would be all of them. The medieval solution? Smoke them out. Literally. People would hang clothes over burning herbs to drive out fleas. Some households burned juniper or wormwood in their fireplaces for the same reason. Others simply beat their mattresses and bedding with sticks and hoped for the best. And then there were the flea traps, simple bowls of honey, or sweet oil placed under beds to lure them in. They worked about as well as yelling at a rainstorm. And then there were the rashes. You roll up your tunic to inspect a spot on your ribs that's been bothering you for days. It's red or patchy. Maybe fungal, maybe just angry skin from constant friction, damp linen, or questionable soap. But there's no ointment, no doctor on call. You're left with the usual options. Ignore it, cover it with cloth, or ask the local wise woman for a salve made from pig fat and crushed herbs. It might help, it might also make it worse. Either way, scratching is the only consistent relief and the most dangerous. Because scratching broke skin. And broken skin? That's an open door to infection in a world where antiseptic wasn't a word yet. Small wounds festered. Sores spread, boils popped up overnight. Entire limbs could go septic from what started as a flea bite. That weird smell you noticed coming off the blacksmith's apprentice last week? Probably not his shoes. Here's your fringe fact. Some medieval physicians believed that skin parasites were a natural part of the human body. Not invaders, but companions. One theory even suggested lice were a form of overflow from a body with too much heat or corruption. Let that sink in. You're not infested, you're venting. Like a chimney, with legs. Of course not everyone just gave up. Some people shaved their heads entirely to fight lice. A method especially popular in monasteries where baldness already symbolised humility. Monks wore tonsures for religious reasons, but it conveniently helped with scalp maintenance too. Women, on the other hand, rarely shaved, so lice tended to flourish under those intricate braids and veils. You notice a nobleman across the road getting his beard combed by a servant. The comb is bone, the movement's careful, and the servant has a cloth ready to catch what falls. It's a quiet act of service, but also of pest control, because even silk-lined robes and pomander chains won't keep bugs out of your armpits. That's the thing, there was no class immunity here. You could be covered in furs and gold and your underthings would still be crawling. There were records of kings scratching their scalps during council meetings, of ladies swatting fleas under the table, of entire court gatherings fidgeting through banquets because everyone was just so itchy. And nobody judged, because they were all in the same miserable boat. There's an open debate among historians about how truly resigned people were to these infestations. Some argue that complaints in letters and religious texts show how hated the constant itching was. Others suggest that cultural tolerance ran deep, that people viewed these irritations as the way we view bad traffic or seasonal allergies. Annoying, but not unusual. Just one of life's many curses. You duck into a nearby cottage, where a woman is boiling linens in a cauldron, one of the few proven ways to kill lice and flea eggs. The steam fills the room. She looks exhausted. "If you don't boil 'em, they come back by nightfall," she mutters. The water smells of lye and rosemary. You feel vaguely cleaner just standing there. But then she lifts a pair of trousers from the pot and a dead flea floats to the surface. You realise it's a never-ending war, and today was just one minor victory. You leave the cottage, itching still, but grateful you're not alone in it. You pass a man walking with a visible limp, his leg wrapped in a rag soaked with garlic and vinegar. Probably an infected bite. Probably won't get better, but he's walking, scratching his arm, and swearing under his breath. Because if there's one thing every medieval person had in common, it was this shared, awful, unending itch. The one they couldn't stop, the one no one talked about, and the one they all scratched together under the same dirty sun. You're leaving the village now, headed out toward the open countryside. The muddy streets give way to foot-worn paths, and soon enough you're surrounded by wide, uneven fields dotted with sheep, squat little cottages, and piles, so many piles of manure. Welcome to rural medieval life, where the air might be a bit fresher, the horizon wider and the neighbours farther apart, but the hygiene? Oh, friend. It's a different kind of dirty out here. Less plague in the street, more everything you touch smells like cow. You pass a farmer kneeling by a ditch, elbow deep in something that used to be a pig. He waves casually with his cleanest hand and goes right back to whatever he's doing, possibly birthing something, possibly butchering something else. In the countryside, boundaries blur fast. Kitchens double as animal sheds. Bathing spots double as watering holes. And toilets, well, you're probably standing near one right now. Let's start with the basics. In a medieval rural household, there was no plumbing, no chamber pots lined with velvet, no privy tucked into a castle wall with a scenic drop into the moat. No, most peasants had a toilet that was either a hole in the ground, the edge of the woods, or a particularly absorbent patch of earth behind the barn. Some families shared a shallow pit for their waste, which would periodically be covered with straw or ash and relocated when the smell became unbearable, or when someone stepped in it by accident. Charming. You pass a cottage where a barefoot child is chasing a chicken through what is, unmistakably, a pile of animal dung. He's laughing, you're wincing. But this is everyday life in the medieval countryside. Mud and manure were not enemies, they were building materials. Walls were daubed with it, floors were packed with it, and crops were fertilised by it. If it smelled, it was probably useful. The human nose just had to keep up. Washing? Technically possible. Rivers, ponds and rain barrels were available, and people did occasionally rinse themselves off. But regular, full-body bathing? Rare. Partially because heating water required firewood and time, two things in short supply for a peasant family, and partially because of that ever-present fear that too much washing could make you sick. In winter, water was freezing. In summer, it was full of algae, and you could never be entirely sure if the last person who used the stream was washing clothes or bleeding a chicken into it. Clothing wasn't washed often either. Undergarments, yes, maybe once a week if the household could afford the time and soap, but outer garments? Those were spot cleaned at best. You'd hang them to air out, brush off the worst of the filth, and hope that the smell of hay or wood smoke would overpower whatever else was clinging to the fabric. In fact, if you stood downwind from most rural folk, you'd get a whiff of farm life, which was mostly a mix of body odour, smoke, animal sweat, sour milk and damp wool. Here's your fringe fact of the day. In many rural communities, urine was a common household item. It was collected in pots and used for everything from cleaning wool to removing stains. Aged urine, known delightfully as lant, was even used in laundry. Its ammonia content made it surprisingly effective for bleaching. So yes, if your tunic looks a little brighter than usual today, it's probably been washed in a week-old bucket of peasant pee. That shine didn't come from sunshine, friend. You stop by a thatched roof cottage where a woman is scrubbing her floor with a broom made of bundled twigs. The floor is just dirt, packed hard with age and use, but she's sweeping anyway. Rural cleanliness wasn't about sterility, it was about order. Keeping waste outside, food off the ground, and tools in the right place. It wasn't pretty, but it worked well enough. And the people, they weren't blind to the grime, they noticed. They felt it. But when survival is the main goal, comfort and hygiene are luxury thoughts. Most families were focused on making it through the planting season, not exfoliating. You ate, worked, bled, and sweated in the same clothes for days. If you were lucky, you had a separate tunic for Sunday church services. If you weren't, you wiped the mud off your knees and went in smelling like sheep because God already knew what you were made of. You sit for a moment on a log near a field and watch as a boy leads a donkey cart down a path. The donkey, naturally, relieves itself mid-step. The boy barely notices. Behind them, a woman follows with a shovel and adds the droppings to a pile near the edge of the field. It'll be spread over the crops tomorrow. This is resource management medieval style. Nothing wasted, nothing tiered, everything useful. Even the stink. Now, there's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether rural peasants were more or less hygienic than their urban counterparts. Some argue that life in the countryside, with its access to fresh air, natural water sources and fewer people crammed into one space, allowed for a cleaner existence. Others point out that peasants were often too overworked and under-resourced to care about hygiene, relying more on folklore and faith than soap or scrubbing. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in between. You might be further from the city sewer, but you're closer to the pig pen. Still, you can't help but admire the resilience of it all. These people worked with their hands in soil, blood and ash, slept beside animals, and woke each day covered in dust, and they just kept going. Filthy? Absolutely. But functional. The village worked. The fields yielded food, the people, despite boils and bites and the occasional rash that looked suspiciously like witchcraft, endured. As you get up to leave, you brush off your tunic, but the dirt clings anyway. It always does out here. not just to your clothes, but to your skin, your hair, your very being. It's not that you live in the filth, it's that eventually the filth becomes part of you, a badge of labour, a crust of survival. Out here, if you aren't at least a little filthy, you probably aren't working hard enough. The road ahead winds back toward the city, but not the one you first entered. This place feels different, brighter, cleaner, like someone's been scrubbing at the corners of the world with a stiff-bristled brush. The roofs are a little straighter, the cobbled streets a little more deliberate. It's not exactly modern, not yet, but there's a shift in the air, in the people, even in the smells, less rotting meat, more fresh bread, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of soap. Welcome to the slow return of cleanliness, the Renaissance. When Europe started scrubbing itself off, one public bath and Latin manuscript at a time. You pass a man reading aloud in a square surrounded by students. The words he speaks are from Galen, maybe Hippocrates, but it's the language that matters. Greek, Latin, Arabic texts rediscovered, translated, and debated. You're watching the gears of intellectual rebirth turn. People are talking about health, medicine, anatomy, even sanitation, actual sanitation, like they're rediscovering a lost treasure. Because in a way they are. The ancient world, especially the Romans, had known a thing or two about staying clean. And now, finally, someone's dusting off the archives and saying, wait a minute, they had drains? You duck into a courtyard where a woman is scrubbing her steps with a broom, a bucket of water beside him. It's a small thing, but significant. In the past few centuries, water had gone from being feared, carrying disease, tempting sin, to being managed, controlled, channeled. Urban leaders are beginning to rebuild aqueducts, dig new wells, and even experiment with primitive sewage systems. It's not exactly the golden age of hygiene, but it's definitely the age of trying again. Bathing begins to creep back into the cultural imagination, not just as a medical treatment, but as a pleasurable, even artistic act. You find a poster nailed to a wall advertising a new public bathhouse, cleanliness and steam for the civilized gentleman. Sure, it's still segregated by class and gender, and yes, there's probably still syphilis in the water, but the intent has changed. Bathing is becoming trendy, respectable, even recommended. In wealthier homes, you now see washstands with mirrors, pitchers of water, cloths, combs, powders, even handmade soaps that don't smell like they were boiled with regret. Merchants import scented oils from the East. Apothecaries grind herbs for fresh breath and clear skin. And people, real people, begin to think of hygiene not just as something you do for health, but something you do for identity. You are clean because you are learned, because you are enlightened, because you read Plato and know where to find rosemary oil. Here's your fringe fact. One of the first major hygiene influences of this period was Queen Elizabeth I, despite the myths that she only bathed once a month or once a year, depending on how rude the source is. Records suggest she was relatively fastidious for her time. She owned mirrors, multiple mirrors, and had access to cosmetics, tooth cleaning tools, and fine linen shifts. Her court was known for smelling faintly of rosewater and politics, so much politics, but also rosewater. Of course, none of this was universal. For every clean Renaissance man sketching anatomical diagrams and gargling mint, there were still thousands of labourers sharing lice with their livestock. This wasn't a magical transformation. It was a slow grind, a collective inching toward modern standards with plenty of filth left in the cracks. The wealthy embraced the trend first, the urban middle class followed. The poor? Well, they'd get there eventually, though they'd likely be judged for doing it wrong. You stop by a vendor selling soaps wrapped in cloth, each bar stamped with a family crest. He sees you eyeing the merchandise and hands you a sample. From Castile, he says proudly, olive oil and lye, no tallow. You sniff it. It smells like citrus and ambition. Soap isn't just hygiene now, it's status. Owning it says you're someone who cares, who matters, who has access to things beyond the village ditch. Meanwhile, physicians begin writing treatises on hygiene, actual books that recommend washing hands before meals, keeping wounds clean, and brushing teeth with ground sage or salt. Sure, some of the advice is still medieval nonsense, yes, we're still bleeding people, but the intent has changed. Cleanliness is starting to mean health, not vanity. Dirt isn't just humble anymore, it's potentially deadly. You pass a school where children are being taught Latin phrases and how to wash their faces in the morning. In the same breath, the teacher recites a passage about the humours and tells them to keep their feet dry and their heads warm. It's not science as we know it, but it's better. And it signals a cultural change, that the body is worth caring for, not just tolerating. There's a scholarly debate about what triggered this shift. Was it the rediscovery of classical texts, increased urbanisation and public health crises? The influence of Islamic medicine and hygiene practices? Probably all of the above. The Renaissance was a stew of ideas, languages, trade and plagues. It shook Europe awake, not just intellectually but physically. When you're living through repeated outbreaks of death, how you live starts to matter more. You see it in the architecture too. Some new homes are built with drainage channels. Courtyards have access to water. Privies are still rudimentary, but they're being located farther from kitchens and sleeping quarters. Cities begin to appoint inspectors to check wells, monitor butchers, fine citizens for tossing waste into the streets. It's not glamorous, but it is progress. You find yourself outside a bathhouse, steam rising from small windows. Inside, tiled walls gleam with candlelight. A man reclines on a stone bench while an attendant pours warm water over his shoulders. He looks half asleep, half enlightened. You realise something. Bathing has become beautiful again. Not just tolerated or feared, but desired. Reimagined. Of course there are still skeptics. Some religious leaders grumble about the return of indulgence. Some physicians worry about imbalances of heat and moisture. And most peasants, still boiling water one pot at a time if they bother at all, but the wheel has turned. The darkness of suspicion, the fear of pores, the shaming of the clean, the elevation of filth, is slowly, creakily being replaced by something else. Not modern hygiene yet, not exactly, but curiosity, a willingness to experiment, to cleanse, to try. You walk out into the city square again and realise the stink is still there. Faint, familiar, but so is the scent of rosemary. And that's enough to make you believe something has changed. You're standing now at the edge of time, not literally, but it feels like it. The medieval world behind you is starting to fade. The lice, the latrines, the scent of wet wool and open gutters. Before you, a new age begins to unfurl, unevenly and full of contradictions. You can feel it in the wind, in the sharper clatter of trade carts, in the rising chatter about science and cities and something called progress. You've made it to the threshold of the early modern era and hygiene. Hygiene is about to become a battlefield. Not a physical one, though given how aggressively people will argue over tooth powder and linen changes, it might as well be, but a cultural one. This is where the narrative finally splits. Some people push forward into soap, science and sanitation, and others double down on not trusting water, doctors, or anyone who suggests maybe you should clean behind your ears. Let's start with the home. You pass a merchant's house, tall, narrow, and freshly whitewashed. It even has glass windows, a serious flex. Inside, the household is in motion. Servants scrubbing floors with vinegar, children being inspected for lice, linens hung to air out in the courtyard. The mother of the house stands at a washstand, carefully dabbing her face with a scented cloth, then rinsing her fingers in a basin of rosewater. It's more ritual than deep cleaning, but still, this is daily hygiene, finally making a consistent appearance. You lean against the doorway and take it in. Rooms with designated uses, wooden boards scrubbed clean, a chamber pot that's emptied more than once a week. Small details, big shift. Public health is becoming a thing. Cities are hiring inspectors, yes, actual people with clipboards, parchments, to monitor wells, meat markets and bathhouses. Regulations are being drafted. Fines are issued for throwing filth into the streets. Water infrastructure is slowly improving, and though it's not exactly safe yet, people are starting to ask the right questions, like should the same river be used for drinking, bathing, and washing your cow's infected hooves? Probably not. We're learning. And then there's the printing press. Maybe the filthiest thing to ever lead to better hygiene. Because with books comes access to knowledge. Not just theology or poetry, but practical knowledge. Manuals on health, recipes for soap, illustrated guides to anatomy, tips on how not to die of plague, pamphlets with terrifying drawings of people who didn't boil their linens. Literacy means that even non-nobles can now learn how to avoid being disgusting, or at least less disgusting. Here's your quirky fact. One of the first best-selling health books in early modern Europe was Regimen Sanitatis Salinitanum, a poetic medical guide written in Latin rhyming couplets. It dished out advice like, do not bathe when full of meat, and do not sleep with head too low. Sound medical science? Not always, but it marked a shift, a growing obsession with health and hygiene, even if the methods were questionably effective. Still, things aren't spotless, far from it. You stop near a butcher's stall where flies dance in thick clouds around slabs of meat hanging in the sun. A man sneezes into his hand and then uses it to slap a steak onto a hook. His apron is red with something that's definitely not tomato sauce. The customer doesn't blink. Progress is slow and some habits, especially the truly gross ones, die hard. You keep walking and pass a barber-surgeon shop. Inside, a man is having a tooth yanked with pliers the size of a crowbar, his other hand gripping a bowl filled with blood and what looks like a button. Cleanliness? Relative. Tools are wiped with cloth, the floor is swept occasionally. But soap and sterilisation are still decades away from being standard. The idea that germs exist is not even on the radar. It'll take another 200 years and one very determined man named Pasteur to connect the dots between invisible things and dying horribly. There's still a big social divide too. The upper classes are embracing new habits, brushing teeth with crushed herbs, perfuming underarms, changing shirts daily. But for most commoners, daily bathing is still unrealistic. Firewood is expensive, soap is taxed, and time is for work. So people adapt with dry methods, scraping skin, combing hair, brushing off clothes. You don't need to be clean as long as you look like you tried. But appearances start to matter more now. With growing cities and rising commerce, how you smell and look can affect your social mobility. A merchant with greasy hair might lose customers. A woman who reeks of sour milk might not get a husband. Cleanliness becomes a kind of currency, a signal that you're educated, employable, or at least not harbouring fleas. And with this shift comes a return of something we haven't seen in a while. Shame. People begin to hide their dirt instead of accepting it. Chamber pots are tucked behind screens. Washstands become private. Cleanliness, once a luxury or suspicion, now leans toward expectation, at least for those who can afford it. There's still debate in academic circles about whether this period truly marks the beginning of modern hygiene. Some say it's a cosmetic shift, more about looking clean than being clean. Others point to rising urban planning, soap production, and medical manuals as proof that people were genuinely changing their habits. But one thing is clear. The association between cleanliness and morality returns in full force. Filth is no longer humble, it's shameful. And the cleaner you are, the more righteous, or at least the more employable, you appear. You pause outside a church where a monk is preaching about purity, not of soul but of body. He quotes scripture, sure, but then pivots to health, to appearance, to the need to cleanse the body as a temple. 100 years ago this would have sounded suspicious. Now? People nod. They believe. They've seen plague tear through cities, watched their neighbours rot, and they're starting to connect the dots. Cleanliness is safety. Cleanliness is godliness. Cleanliness might be your only defence. As the sermon ends, you walk toward a fountain where people are filling jugs, washing their hands, even splashing this on their faces. Children giggle. A woman pours rosewater over her wrists. Somewhere nearby, a bar of soap floats in a bucket like a holy relic. You realise something, standing there. This journey, from mud-caked fields to perfumed courtyards, hasn't been about getting rid of filth. It's been about understanding it. Why we stink, why we scratch, why we hide the grime or wear it like armour. Hygiene in the medieval world wasn't just physical, it was moral, spiritual and political. A mirror of who you were and what you believed. And even now, at the edge of modernity, the battle between body and world continues, just with slightly better smelling soap. You lean back now, not against a crumbling tavern wall or the edge of a flea-bitten straw mattress, but in your own space, wherever that might be. Maybe there's a fan hums gently into the background, or the faint buzz of traffic outside. Maybe your sheets are clean, your hands freshly washed, your socks not made of wool and sorrow. Whatever the case, you've made it out. You've trudged through centuries of dirt, lice, spit, and suspicious-smelling people, and somehow you're still standing, slightly traumatized but undeniably wiser. So what did we learn? That bathing was once considered sinful, that lice were basically family pets. That if you washed your hands too often, someone might accuse you of witchcraft. That royalty smelled just as bad, maybe worse than the peasants. That sometimes soap was made with animal fat and ash and somehow marketed as a luxury. That people genuinely believed too much cleanliness might kill you. And through it all, the stink, the superstition, the sheer stubborn grime of it all, the most consistent thing wasn't filth itself. It was the way people explained it, justified it, lived with it, because hygiene back then wasn't a choice. It was a negotiation. Between fear and faith, between availability and belief, between what was possible and what was worth the effort. And in the end, maybe that's the point. It's easy to mock the Middle Ages, to picture every person as a walking rash with bad teeth. But the truth is, they were doing the best they could with the tools they had, and the terrifying ideas they'd been taught. And you get to live in a world where hot water pours from a wall and shampoo doesn't double as a chemical weapon. Luxury. So tonight, as you crawl into your hopefully not straw-stuffed bed, take a second to appreciate your soap, your toothbrush, your trash pickup, your disease-free bath, because history is full of people who walked so you could shower. Sleep tight, dream clean, and for the love of history, please wash your sheets once in a while.